Theirs was a textbook romance between a young co-ed with a promising future
She had her whole life ahead of her.
and a dashing young man who swore to love her till death do they part.
They seem very happy living with one another and honeymooning and things of that nature. No problems, no issues, no nothing.
But less than a year after their sacred vows, an inexplicable crime shattered their lives.
She had been stabbed. It was a bloodbath.
Why? Why her? Why anybody? But definitely why her?
To unmask a killer, police would have to navigate a twisted path of sexual obsession, betrayal, and lies.
It was passionate, it was hot, and it was dangerous.
You just couldn't make this up if you tried.
You have a killer who is enraged, maybe even deranged or psychotic.
Wednesday, January 30th, 2008, 7:30 a.m. It's a cold winter morning in Raleigh, North Carolina. But as the sun rises over the city, morning commuters spot something alongside Interstate 540 that takes their breath away.
Several drivers headed west on I-540 noticed what appeared to be a body off to the side of the road.
As 911 calls pour into dispatch, first responders race to the scene.
16197.
There, they find a young woman lying in the grass. But sadly, it's much too late. She's dead.
The first thought that authorities probably had was that she was perhaps a pedestrian. Maybe she got hit by accident on the side of the road.
But when police take a closer look at the woman's body, they quickly realize this is no ordinary accident.
No, she's not been hit, she's been stabbed.
Okay, I'll get major crimes.
They can see that she has been stabbed repeatedly about her face and throat. It's apparent that she has been murdered.
Who exactly is this woman, and how did she get here? Investigators search the area for clues. But there's no trace of a murder weapon, nor are there any eyewitnesses to the crime.
They had canvassed the whole area, asking drivers if anybody had seen anything. But this was basically along a stretch of very busy highway.
One of those commuters is a man named Darren Curtis. At approximately 7:45 a.m., he drives by the crime scene and, like many, slows down to take a look.
On his way to work on I-540, Darren notices traffic is backed up. He passes a crime scene. He sees a body under a blue tarp. Just a half mile later, he spots a white car, strongly resembling his wife's, on the side of the road.
Darren's curiosity quickly turns to panic. The vehicle definitely belongs to his wife, Latrice. Frantic, Darren Curtis goes back to the crime scene he just passed. Detectives confirm Darren's worst fear. The deceased woman is indeed his wife, beautiful 21-year-old Latrice Curtis. Darren isn't the only one to feel the stinging loss. Latrice's father soon learns the devastating news.
I've got some really bad news. Latrice is dead.
All kind of things went through my head, man. I didn't know whether to be mad. I didn't know who to start blaming. Like, okay, this is a dream. Okay, we're gonna wake up in a minute and it's gonna be over with, man.
But it's not a dream. It's a nightmare. One that's just beginning to unfold. As police attempt to uncover the truth, they'll descend into a world of dark secrets and twisted fantasies.
They've had this extramarital, possibly salacious, risque relationship.
It seemed that everyone in this case was keeping secrets, and I mean everyone.
Latrice Curtis grew up in a loving home full of big brothers.
Being the only girl, she got the special attention. She got to get away with things that the boys never got away with.
Blessed with good looks and an infectious smile, Latrice was one of the most popular girls in high school.
Latrice was always a people person. She could just walk up to you and just start a conversation. She was just adorable.
It was no surprise that Latrice had more than her fair share of male admirers. But this driven young woman always put her education first.
Latrice was a good student. She just wanted to succeed.
That hard work paid off when Latrice was accepted into a local college in Raleigh. And it was during her very first semester
Sorry.
that she met a dashing and ambitious accounting student named Darren Curtis.
Excuse me. Is it okay if I sit here? Sure.
They seem to mesh with each other pretty well.
What are you working on? Something for my psychology class. Nothing major. What do you have for psych this year? Dr. Brown. Oh, I'm sorry.
Latrice and Darren instantly hit it off, and it wasn't long before the studious pair became an item.
It was definitely special. It was different in every way. She loved him.
Would you want to come with me? Grab a bite?
Soon after Darren and Latrice started dating, she introduced him to her family. Right away, they could tell there was something different about Darren. A former National Guard soldier, he was respectful, mature, and quickly won them over.
After I spoke with him, my perception of him actually changed. You know, he was a really good kid.
Did you have fun tonight?
I did.
Good.
I enjoyed myself.
Latrice and Darren were so head over heels in love that just 1 year into their relationship, they decided they should spend the rest of their lives together.
Latrice, will you marry me?
Yes!
After saying I do, the couple moved into a cozy apartment, and Latrice transferred to prestigious North Carolina Central University in nearby Durham to finish her degree in business administration. But despite their long hours apart, Latrice seemed ecstatic about her and Darren's future together.
She was just starting out her life, her married life, her professional life. She was really just somebody that had her whole future ahead of her.
But on the morning of January 30th, 2008, just 9 short months after her wedding day, that future is severed in the most horrific way imaginable.
This is a senseless, shocking crime. I mean, who in the world would do something like this?
As police expand the search for Latrice's killer, what they don't know is that this search will lead them into a world of sex, lies, and hidden desires, where it seems everyone has something to hide. College students Darren and Latrice Curtis shared a love that knew no bounds. But just 9 months into their marriage, their lives were torn apart when police found Latrice brutally stabbed to death on the side of a North Carolina interstate. Surprisingly, one of the first people at the scene was her husband, Darren.
He actually drove out by the scene and saw his wife's car out there.
While first responders try and console Darren, investigators begin processing the bloody scene.
Latrice Curtis was brutally assaulted in this homicide. She was stabbed upwards of 40 times about her face, her neck, her chest, her torso. Her carotid artery was slashed open. Her jugular vein was slashed open. Her vocal cords were cut.
Man, she's got 20 or 30 stab wounds.
I mean, it didn't look like it's a robbery. She's got her earrings.
Although investigators still have no idea what prompted Latrice's violent death, one thing is certain.
Look at her hands.
Yeah, looks like she's been fighting.
She hadn't gone down without a fight.
It looks like there's been a struggle.
Hey, man, can you bag the hands? Yeah. Thank you.
The victim's fingernails were examined, and it was pretty clear that there was some injury or damage to her nails.
As CSIs bagged Latrice's hands, detectives head a half-mile down the interstate to the location of Latrice's abandoned vehicle. It's immediately apparent that a struggle has taken place inside.
The center console is broken, and it looks like blood is on the driver's side door.
But what is Latrice's car doing so far away from her body? An examination of the vehicle suggests someone other than Latrice drove her car last.
There was a DNA sample left on Latrice's car on the steering wheel.
While CSI send the DNA evidence they collected from both Latrice's car and her fingernails to the state crime lab for analysis, detectives ponder the killer's possible motive.
The question really is, who would want to hurt her, and who would want to kill her so violently and so brutally?
It's the same question Latrice's heartbroken family is asking.
Why? Why her? Why anybody? But definitely, why her?
Is it possible Latrice had been the tragic victim of a random crime? To investigators, that theory seems unlikely.
When a person is murdered in a way like this, it looks so personal, so filled with hate.
You don't need to stab someone 40 times to kill them. So if you're stabbing someone 40 times, you are enraged, you are angry.
But just who could be that angry with a good girl like Latrice? With her family at a loss, police turn to the man closest to Latrice, her husband, Darren.
About what time did you see Latrice?
Darren explains that the last time he'd spoken to his wife was the previous evening around 10 p.m.
How did she seem to you? Was she upset or normal?
She seemed fine.
She calls her husband to say, I'm running late from school and I'm gonna get something to eat, so I'll be late getting home.
Around 11:30, Darren goes to sleep. He hasn't heard from his wife, Latrice, but figures she may have gone to eat at her family's home and perhaps just stayed there.
Darren says that when he woke up the next morning, he telephoned Latrice, but the call went straight to voicemail.
Just calling to check on you, making sure you're okay. If you would, just give me a call back whenever you get this. Bye.
Darren assumed Latrice might still be asleep, so he decided to shower and then left for work around 7:30 a.m.
On his way to work that morning on I-540, Darren notices traffic is backed up. He then passes a crime scene with yellow tape and a body under a blue tarp.
Darren says he felt a knot in his stomach as he passed the scene, and then just moments later spotted his wife's car.
So you just happened to be driving by, or what? Why'd you stop?
Man, I was on my way to work. I take the 540 every day.
While Darren's story sounds plausible, it seems awfully coincidental to detectives that he discovered his wife's car and arrived at the crime scene before police contacted him.
From outside, everything looked fine between Darren and Latrice. But was there something about their marriage that no one knew about?
Detectives decide to take Darren down to the station for further questioning.
Darren, unbutton your sleeves, please. Let me see your hands and your arms.
Darren is questioned and photographed. They're looking for cuts and abrasions.
Unbutton your collar up there for me.
There are no outward signs Darren has been in any type of physical altercation. Still, investigators have a few hard questions they need to ask him.
Tell me about you and Latrice. Were you having any marital problems or anything?
No, we loved each other.
Do you mind if we checked your house and your car?
You guys can do whatever you need to do.
With Darren's blessing, police search the apartment, but find no signs of a struggle in the couple's home or in Darren's car.
There's absolutely no physical evidence tying him to the crime scene.
Okay, Darren. You're gonna be free to leave, all right? But don't leave town.
Detectives released Darren that afternoon, but upon receiving Latrice's autopsy report, they make a shocking discovery.
When the autopsy was done on Latrice Curtis's body, there was a condom found.
This condom found inside her during the autopsy tells law enforcement that she may have had intercourse recently.
But judging by her injuries, it doesn't appear Latrice had been raped.
There were no injuries in her genital area consistent with sexual assault.
The discovery, however, raises more troubling questions. For starters, whose condom was it? And could sex have somehow sparked this vicious attack?
What's this number here?
With this case growing more salacious by the minute,
Does that look familiar?
investigators decide to subpoena Darren and Latrice's phone records.
It's Darren.
Pouring through the call log, Darren's story appears to check out.
So he called her at 10, and the next morning, just like he said he did.
But to their surprise, Latrice also made and received a flurry of calls from another number around midnight before she was murdered.
There's a bunch of calls from that number. It says it comes back to a Stephen Randolph.
Who is Stephen Randolph? The answer to that question would prove to be one of the keys to unlocking the mystery behind Latrice's death. And his new wife, Latrice, hoped to build a beautiful life together. But those dreams appear to have died on the side of a North Carolina freeway when Latrice was found brutally stabbed to death.
She was really a young woman that was just starting out her life. She had her whole life ahead of her.
Police have already questioned and released Darren. But phone records, along with a condom found inside Latrice's body, have cops wondering if the last person she had contact with, a man named Stephen Randolph, is somehow involved in this crime.
Law enforcement have questions for him. They're going to want to look really closely at Stephen Randolph.
While police begin searching for Stephen, investigators try and flesh out his connection to Latrice. Turns out, Stephen Randolph is one of the most eligible bachelors on NCCU's campus.
He was a very attractive young man. He was an athlete. He was a basketball player.
Randolph was trying to establish a career in the NBA as a professional basketball player.
So what's Stephen Randolph's connection to Latrice? While friends aren't 100% certain, they do tell investigators that Stephen and Latrice had definitely grown close in recent months.
They began socializing there and apparently some level getting interested in each other, perhaps flirting or something to that effect.
Were Stephen and Latrice more than just friends? The only person who can answer that question for certain is Stephen himself. Thankfully, it doesn't take police long to find him. 2 days after Latrice's body is discovered,
Excuse me, officer? Yes, sir.
Stephen walks into the Wake County Sheriff's Office.
Hey, my name is Stephen Randolph.
He walked through the front door of the sheriff's office like a gift.
I'm here to speak with a detective about the Latrice Curtis case.
But Stephen isn't alone.
CID, please.
Standing beside him is his roommate, a local pastor named Robert Reeves.
Stephen Randolph went to the police station with Robert Reeves in tow at Robert Reeves' insistence.
How's he doing? How you doing? See you. Hey, Ray, how you doing? Can you take him to my office, please, and I'll get this one.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
All right, sir, if you'll go right this way.
Yes, sir, officer.
Leading Stephen into an interrogation room, detectives get right to work.
So tell me about Latrice and you. How'd you know her?
We had a few classes together. We met back in September. Just friends.
Just friends?
Stephen tells detectives that as their friendship deepened, Latrice would sometimes stop by his house to study.
Okay, so you were just in class together, nothing more than that?
That's it.
But when confronted with phone records, along with the findings of their autopsy report, Stephen begins to backpedal.
I'm gonna go ahead and be honest with you. We had a private relationship.
Latrice came to see Stephen on the night of the murder. It was only the second time she had been there. And they had an intimate encounter.
They were just friends. But that relationship evolved into a passionate sexual affair.
So you wore a condom?
Yes. Actually, the condom got trapped inside of her.
They tried it, they couldn't get it out.
Stephen says Latrice told him she'd have better luck removing the condom in the privacy of her own bathroom and left his house around 10 p.m. A few minutes later, Stephen followed suit.
Stephen drove off to clear his head. After driving around for a while, he ended up at his girlfriend's home, Velma Newton.
According to Stephen, shortly after he arrived at Velma Newton's home, Latrice started blowing up his cell phone.
Was just going crazy about it.
She's going home to her husband with another man's used condom inside of her body. And she's talking with Steve about the possibility of her becoming pregnant as a result.
So that's what all the phone calls were about?
Yeah.
It was about that?
Yeah.
So you're telling me you didn't kill her?
No.
Stephen is adamant he had nothing to do with Latrice's murder. But why hadn't he been more forthcoming about their sexual affair? And had he really visited his girlfriend, Velma Newton, after having sex with Latrice?
Hey, Reverend, how are you, sir?
Hey, how are you, detective?
Good.
Hoping to get to the bottom of things, police turned to Stephen's housemate, Robert Reeves. A 43-year-old pastor, Reeves is affectionately known as the Bishop in Durham's tight-knit evangelical community.
He was known as a very charismatic person. He worked as a motivational speaker.
Just got a few questions, if you don't mind. Can you tell me something about Stephen?
Actually, we met at a car wash.
Reeves tells police he met Stephen in late summer of 2007.
Stephen explains that he's fallen on hard times. He's out of money, needs a job, and perhaps a place to stay.
Seemed like a fine young man. I had the room at the time at my house.
Pastor Reeves offered to let Randolph live in a basement apartment in his house and only charged him about $300 a month for rent.
So according to Pastor Reeves, that fall, Stephen moved into the home Reeves shared with his sister. Still curious about the true nature of Stephen and Latrice's relationship, detectives ask Reeves about the events of January 29th. He confirms that Latrice had indeed stopped by their house that evening.
She came by to visit Stephen, and I was actually on my way to a church service.
Pastor Reeves told police that on the night of the murder, he saw Latrice's car parked outside of his house.
Reeves says at 8:15 p.m. he left the house to attend a church service and returned home around 11:30.
When you got back, were there cars there?
No, Stephen and Latrice, both cars were gone. Both cars were gone.
Reeves tells detectives that though he didn't notice anything unusual that night, The following morning, Stephen confided in him about a phone conversation he had with Latrice around midnight, something Stephen hadn't mentioned to police.
During the phone call, Latrice tells Stephen she wants to take their relationship to another level.
He didn't appear to have made any promises to Latrice. It sounds like it may have been more like a roll in the hay. Latrice, it sounds like, was more interested in his long-term relationship.
Based on the new intel provided by Pastor Reeves, police can't help but wonder if Latrice was more serious about their relationship than Stephen. If so, could Stephen have viewed Latrice and her potential pregnancy as a stumbling block on his road to the NBA?
An unwanted pregnancy for a guy who's about to sign a multi-million-dollar contract, or at least if he believes he is, it could be motive for him to not want her around anymore. That is a question mark, a red flag for police.
But it isn't the only red flag police uncover when speaking to Pastor Reeves about Stephen.
Steve did have a knife and sword collection he kept at home.
But police had only just begun to tap the surface of this tawdry tale. Soon, a startling discovery would reveal 4 lives on a collision course, a collision that culminated in bloodshed. It's now been more than 48 hours since Latrice Curtis was found stabbed to death along Interstate 540 in Raleigh, North Carolina. While Latrice's killer has yet to be identified, revelations of a torrid affair, as well as the statement of Stephen's roommate, revered Pastor Robert Reeves, have police wondering if Latrice's extramarital lover, college hoop star Stephen Randolph, has committed the crime.
Randolph and Latrice was having sex, and it appears that the condom got stuck inside of her. There might be a potential that she's pregnant, and with his desire to be an NBA player, that could be a motive to want to get rid of her.
A motive that seems to dovetail nicely with another startling revelation, that Stephen owns a collection of knives and swords.
We know that this victim was stabbed repeatedly with a knife.
Could one of these weapons have been used in the attack? Police decide to execute a search warrant of Randolph's home and car. But after hours of combing the 2 locations, they find no signs of either a struggle or a potential murder weapon. With their search yielding no evidence, detectives attempt to verify Stephen's alibi. To do so, they reach out to his girlfriend, Velma Newton.
Tell me about that night. Did Stephen come over?
Yeah, he came over to my apartment around 10 o'clock.
According to Velma, Stephen shows up at her house at about 10 o'clock and leaves about 1 o'clock in the morning. This is consistent with what Stephen says about what time he left.
But with the coroner's office placing Latrice's time of death somewhere between 1 and 2 a.m., Stephen's alibi isn't exactly airtight.
Velma Newton was asked specifically whether or not there was any unusual behavior on behalf of Stephen that night, the night that Latrice was murdered.
Do you think Stephen may have had something to do with this?
No, there's no way. I mean, he's such a great guy. There's no way he could have done something like this.
Did you have something to do with it?
No.
Is it possible Velma is trying to protect Stephen? Or worse, could she potentially be involved?
No.
But Velma's adamant they're both innocent of the crime. In fact, she believes whoever murdered Latrice Curtis might have been targeting her as well.
She received these very strange, anonymous, threatening phone calls.
They were calling, trying to break us up, pretty much. And they would call over and over and over again.
And the anonymous threats weren't just directed towards Velma.
There were many threatening phone calls to Stephen.
He is warned to stop doing what he's doing, or he's going to get hurt, perhaps jeopardizing his dreams of the NBA.
According to Velma, it wasn't long before the threats began to escalate.
One night after leaving Velma's apartment, Stephen goes to his car and discovers all 4 tires had been slashed.
For detectives, it's a stunning turn of events, which suggests someone didn't exactly approve of Stephen Randolph's sexual escapades.
Is this a coincidence? I mean, does this have anything to do with what happened to Latrice? Can these things be related?
CID.
But before detectives can make sense of the slashed tires and menacing phone calls,
Yes, Trooper.
they get a call from State Trooper Isaac Cooper.
The 29th. What time was it?
Cooper recounts a routine traffic incident he investigated along Interstate 540 on January 30th, around 1:30 a.m. just 6 hours before commuters discovered Latrice's body.
I was driving around checking for disabled vehicles. This vehicle was on the shoulder of 540 eastbound. It had its hazards lights on, so I stopped behind it to see if they were okay.
But when Cooper approached the vehicle, he found it empty. At that point, Cooper called in the vehicle's license plate. While waiting to hear back from dispatch, he scanned the area and spotted another vehicle on the opposite side of the freeway.
There was a white vehicle on the westbound side with its hazards lights on also.
Detectives instantly realized that Cooper's description of this second vehicle is a match for Latrice Curtis's car. Cooper explains that before he got a chance to run the second car's plates, dispatchers requested he respond to another incident. But before Cooper pulled away, he got an update on the first vehicle.
They ran the tag, they responded to me that the vehicle was not stolen, and it came back to Robert Reeves out of Durham, North Carolina.
That's Robert Reeves, as in Pastor Robert Reeves, beloved minister, friend, and roommate of prime suspect Stephen Randolph. But what's the pastor's car doing on the same road where Latrice Curtis's body was found? The answer to that question would not only divide a community, but force police to consider a motive much more twisted than they had previously imagined. Detectives in Wake County, North Carolina, are trying to solve the gruesome murder of 21-year-old college student Latrice Curtis.
This murder was brutal. This woman was stabbed in her face, her throat, her chest. It was a bloodbath.
In the wake of her death, detectives have discovered that the newly married Latrice had become embroiled in a steamy affair with fellow student Stephen Randolph.
Because Randolph had this extramarital relationship with Latrice and she ends up dead, law enforcement are gonna have questions for him.
Randolph's alibi isn't exactly airtight, nor is that of his other girlfriend, Velma Newton. But before investigators can zero in on the couple, the case takes another mysterious turn, one that involves Stephen Randolph's roommate, Pastor Robert Reeves.
There was a trooper driving by that area that night, and he saw Robert Reeves' car on the side of the road.
Had Stephen Randolph used the pastor's car to stalk and kill Latrice Curtis, then abandon the vehicle by the side of the road? Or was Pastor Reeves somehow involved in Latrice's death?
Have your seat.
Detectives have no choice but to bring Robert Reeves back in for another round of questioning.
Let's take it from the top one more time, okay?
Yes, sir.
So tell me again what you did that night.
Robert Reeves said that he was at church earlier in the evening and that he came home and that he stayed home and that he did not drive his car anywhere and that he was not on the side of I-540 that night.
But the pastor also acknowledges it's possible Stephen Randolph borrowed his car.
He had his own set of keys, so he could use it when he needed to use it, and the bishop had let him do that.
Hoping to verify the pastor's story, police reach out to his other roommate, his sister, Willa Mae Thorpe.
According to Reeves, he's at church, the same church that his sister says she was attending the very same night. But she says she never saw him there.
Why is Pastor Reeves lying about his alibi? Is he trying to protect young Stephen Randolph? Or could he be involved in the murder of Latrice Curtis?
Pastor, would you mind rolling up your sleeves for us?
As detectives questioned Reeves, they noticed he had some abrasions on his hands and arms.
You want to explain how you got those scratches? They look pretty deep.
Stephen and I were moving a nice desk. I was going backwards and fell. He scraped up this arm a little bit. Okay, sorry.
Reeves did agree to give a DNA sample.
Open your mouth for me.
Investigators send Pastor Reeves' DNA sample off to the lab.
We're done.
And wait for the results. In the meantime, they bring Stephen Randolph back in for a second interview.
Did you borrow Robert's car?
Yes, I borrowed his car before, but not recently.
Not only does Stephen deny borrowing Pastor Reeves' car the night of the murder, he claims to have no recollection of the pastor being injured while moving a desk.
Did he get hurt moving it?
Oh, no.
Injured in any way?
It was simple.
So there was no accident?
No.
But Stephen's not done. He informs detectives that recently the pastor seemed a little nosy. especially when it came to Stephen and Latrice's steamy romance.
He came in my room once after she left, and he was acting kind of weird, real strange.
After Latrice had left, Reeves comes down and enters Stephen's room. Reeves asked Stephen if he had relations with the woman who just left. Stephen said yes, he did.
According to Stephen, that's when Pastor Reeves asked a truly unusual question.
He asked Randolph if he had ever considered being a male escort, started asking him questions about the size of his penis, started asking him if he'd ever had oral sex done by a man, trying to persuade him that there's really no difference.
Ultimately, one of the things that he offered Stephen Randolph was he said, if you will give me oral sex, I will not charge you rent.
Stephen says he rebuffed Reeves' sexual advances, and the pastor quickly apologized. But according to Stephen, it was shortly after this bizarre encounter that he and girlfriend Velma began receiving anonymous threats and found their tires slashed. For police, it's a startling accusation. But could it possibly be true? To answer that question, police subpoena Pastor Reeves' cell phone records.
They discovered that Reeves had made several blocked calls to Stephen, blocked calls to Stephen's girlfriend, so in all likelihood it was Pastor Reeves who was making those threatening anonymous phone calls.
It became clear to investigators that Robert Reeves was jealous of anyone who was with Stephen Randolph because he was infatuated with Stephen Randolph.
Turns out, Reeves has also been hiding a long history of strange sexual behavior.
He had in the past sexually assaulted at least 2 other men or young boys.
He had this different life. He compartmentalized these 2 parts of his life. There was the pastor, and then there was, for lack of a better term, the sexual predator.
But just because Reeves harbored a secret and deep infatuation for his roommate doesn't necessarily mean he killed Latrice. Or does it? The DNA tests conducted on the pastor, as well as Latrice Curtis and her vehicle, provide some shocking new evidence.
Part of that DNA is Latrice's, but there's another mixture in there, and that belongs to Reeves. Why is his DNA inside of her car?
To investigators, the answer to that question is becoming increasingly apparent.
The belief is that Robert Reeves followed Latrice Curtis from his home that night to the highway where he killed her.
On February 2nd, 2008, police formally charged Pastor Robert Reeves with the murder of Latrice Curtis. The news leaves friends, family, and Durham's religious community stunned.
I was really angry, you know? I know that if I could have got close to him, that, I don't know what would happen, man. I don't know.
There was a complete and utter disbelief from the religious community when he was charged, that they just absolutely had to have the wrong guy.
But prosecutors believe they have the right man. And on September 29, 2009, Robert Reeves is led into a Raleigh courtroom to stand trial for the murder of Latrice Curtis. In their opening arguments, prosecutors paint a chilling picture of a man who'd grown increasingly obsessed with Stephen Randolph. That obsession, they believe, gave way to rage on the night of January 29, 2008.
He was jealous because he was obsessed with Stephen, and Stephen had rebuffed his advances.
Prosecutors assert that after Latrice parted ways with Stephen Randolph the night of the murder, Robert Reeves followed her along Interstate 540, somehow convinced her to pull over, then savagely attacked her.
Reeves killed Latrice to get her out of the way because Latrice was having sex with Randolph. And for some sick reason, he thought that if he got her out the way, then maybe Randolph might give Reeves a chance.
But as the defense points out, if jealousy was indeed their client's motive, why on earth would Pastor Reeves pick a busy interstate as the place to put this plan in motion?
One of the great mysteries of this case was how did Robert Reeves get Latrice Curtis to pull over to the side of the road? But she clearly did pull over, and then this encounter happened.
To bolster their case, Prosecutors point to the slew of evidence connecting Reeves to the crime. The DNA, the state trooper report, and the bizarre anonymous phone threats. Next, prosecutors call Stephen Randolph to the stand to testify. In lurid detail, he recounts the night when Pastor Reeves propositioned him.
There were several pastors from other churches that came to support him. Well, when all the facts started to come out, the pastors weren't sitting in the audience anymore.
But with Stephen Randolph on the stand, defense attorneys see an opportunity. They assert that the person with the most to gain from Latrice's death wasn't Reeves, but her lover and NBA hopeful, Stephen Randolph.
It might be that Steve felt threatened and trapped, possibly trapped by her, and felt that he needed to do something.
The defense also has an explanation for how Pastor Reeves' vehicle ended up at the crime scene around the time Latrice was murdered.
The defense made it clear that there was a possibility that Stephen Randolph could have been driving that car.
It's a compelling argument, but defense attorneys aren't done. They have one more bombshell to drop on the jury. A piece of evidence so startling that some in the courtroom can't help but wonder if the wrong man is standing trial for Latrice Curtis's murder. In a Wake County courtroom, Robert Reeves is on trial for the murder of beautiful college student Latrice Curtis. Prosecutors have alleged the motive behind this crime is the once respected pastor's sexual obsession with Latrice's paramour, Stephen Randolph.
Prosecution's case was Robert Reeves killed Latrice Curtis to keep her away from Steve that he was infatuated with.
But defense attorneys have argued that the man with the most to gain from Latrice's death was Stephen Randolph himself.
The defense argued at trial that it was really Stephen who wanted Latrice dead.
But what about the DNA evidence found in Latrice's car? Defense attorneys argue there's a logical explanation.
The defense at trial attempted to argue that maybe somehow this was some form of transfer DNA.
DNA doesn't stay in one place, it can move. So if she's in that home, she's going to be exposed to all kinds of DNA, particularly on her hands. If she had put her hand on the doorknob, she could pick up the DNA of Robert Reeves.
And as defense attorneys are quick to point out, Reeves' DNA wasn't the only genetic material found at the crime scene.
There was DNA found under Latrice Curtis's fingernails. And that DNA did not belong to Robert Reeves. It belonged to Stephen Randolph.
That really kind of threw me for a loop.
But prosecutors tell the court there's a viable reason Stephen's DNA was found at the scene.
The prosecution argued that that DNA got under her fingernails when she was having sex earlier that night with Stephen Randolph.
As for the defense's transfer DNA theory, prosecutors argue there's simply too much of Robert Reeves' genetic material found at the scene for anyone but the pastor to have committed the crime.
While transfer DNA is possible, it is extremely implausible in this case in light of all the other testimony and evidence, like the fact that Reeves had all of these cuts and scratches on his arms, like the fact that Pastor Reeves claimed to be at church when his sister said he wasn't.
On October 7, 2009, the jury retires to deliberate Robert Reeves' fate. 2 days later, they return with their verdict: guilty.
The defendant, Robert Lee Adams Reeves, was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment without parole.
When they found him guilty, one side of me, okay, we found the right man. Then another side of, this guy's still living. My sister's at a cemetery right now.
While the verdict is met with a mix of sadness and relief, the pain wrought by Reeves' twisted actions still lingers today, especially for Latrice's husband, Darren Curtis.
Darren was just a different person.
The hum of the fluorescent lights in the basement archive of the state police headquarters is a low, persistent frequency, a mechanical vibration that has witnessed the slow, yellowing decay of thousands of unsolved mysteries. It is July 16th, 2026. For 24 years, the file stamped with the case number 02-9984 had remained an undisturbed monument to a terrifying, unresolved afternoon in the autumn of 2002. Imagine the setting: Not a dark, rain-swept industrial dock or a desolate stretch of coastal highway, but the pristine, manicured safety of Whispering Pines, a quiet, affluent suburb located just 30 miles outside of Columbus. This was a community built on the absolute promise of insulation, a place where neighbors did not lock their front doors, where children rode their bicycles through the cul-de-sacs until dusk, and where the crime statistics were represented by minor traffic violations and property line disputes. But on the afternoon of October 12, 2002, that illusion of permanent sanctuary was shattered in a single, silent instant that left a scar across the town's memory. 16-year-old high school sophomore and track athlete Heather Drake walks out of the public library on Oak Street at exactly 4:15 p.m. She has a blue canvas backpack slung over her right shoulder, her training shoes tied to the straps, and her favorite silver-plated locket resting against her collarbone. She is heading toward her home, a quiet, tree-lined walk of just 5 blocks. The autumn air is crisp, the golden leaves of the maples drifting slowly onto the concrete sidewalks, creating a picture-perfect scene of Midwestern peace. She is seen by 3 separate witnesses as she passes the corner store, her head tilted down as she listens to a portable CD player. At 4:22 p.m., she turns onto the narrow pedestrian pathway that cuts through the town's historic Maple Grove, a densely wooded, 20-acre park that acts as a natural green space between the library and the residential estates. She is estimated to have less than 3 minutes of walking remaining before she reaches her driveway. She never emerges from the trees. At 6:30 p.m., as the autumn twilight begins to deepen into a cold, shadow-heavy night, Heather's parents realize that the simple walk has stretched into an impossible, terrifying delay. The police are notified, and within 2 hours, the quiet paths of the Maple Grove are flooded with the harsh, sweeping beams of searchlights, the air thick with the frantic shouting of volunteers, and the deep, baying tracking calls of the county's canine units. The searchers find her blue canvas backpack resting neatly at the base of an ancient, hollow oak tree, its zipper closed, her textbooks and running shoes completely undisturbed inside. But there are no signs of a struggle. No broken branches, no torn fabric, no footprints in the soft, damp earth, and no foreign blood. It is as if Heather Drake had simply dissolved into the cool autumn air, leaving behind nothing but the quiet canvas bag and a void that would consume the community for the next 24 years. The next morning, the headlines of the regional newspapers scream of the suburban silence and the Maple Grove disappearance, turning the once peaceful park into a forbidden, terrifying labyrinth. The local police force, entirely unaccustomed to the complexities of a major abduction investigation, struggles to find a single actionable lead. They interview every resident within a 5-mile radius. They check the registration of every vehicle that passed through the intersection of Oak Street on that afternoon, and they deploy search divers to drag the shallow depths of the community's artificial lake. But the investigation quickly freezes into a series of frustrating, impenetrable dead ends. The DNA technology of 2002 is too primitive to extract an identity from the clean, dry fabric of the canvas backpack, and without a suspect, a weapon, or a scene of violence, the file is quietly slid into the steel drawers of the unsolved registry, a cold case that the town of Whispering Pines would try, and fail, to forget. 24 years pass. The year is 2026. The world has transitioned into a highly connected, digital landscape where every transaction, every movement, and every biological signature is captured by a vast, unyielding network of modern technology. The cardboard box containing the 2002 Drake file has sat undisturbed in the climate-controlled archives, its edges worn, the faint scent of old cedar and floor wax clinging to the paper folders. But inside the state's newly reorganized high-technology forensic unit, a team of young investigators is looking at the past through a lens that did not exist when Heather took her final walk. They are armed with the modern advancements of low-template DNA processing and investigative genetic genealogy, a combination of tools that treats every cold case file as a sleeping biological map waiting to be awakened by the progress of the future. The breakthrough begins on a quiet morning in late June 2026. A forensic technician, working under the strict parameters of the state's cold case review program, pulls Heather's blue canvas backpack from its heat-sealed plastic evidence envelope. In 2002, the original investigators had dusted the metal buckles and the plastic zippers for fingerprints, finding nothing but the victim's own faint, partial prints. But the 2026 team understands the mechanics of contact DNA. They are not looking for visible stains, but rather the microscopic, friction-transferred skin cells that are left behind whenever an individual exerts physical force to grip or slide a heavy zipper. They deploy an ultra-sensitive vacuum-assisted microswab to sweep the tight, synthetic weave of the fabric surrounding the backpack's main zipper pull, a protected, interior zone that had remained insulated from the dust and environmental contamination of the storage vaults for nearly a quarter of a century. The vacuum swab draws out the microscopic, protein-protected biological residue that has been trapped inside the nylon fibers since the autumn of 2002, translating the ancient cells into a clean, highly detailed digital DNA sequence. When the sequence is run through the national criminal databases, it returns a hollow, frustrating silence. The contributor has never been arrested for a crime that required a genetic profile. But the investigators do not stop at the edge of the database. They upload the profile to public ancestral networks, building a massive, branching digital family tree that stretches back to the early settlers of the Ohio Valley. The algorithm works with a quiet, terrifying speed, calculating kinship coefficients, matching shared genetic segments, and narrowing the pool of potential suspects to a single, highly localized bloodline residing right in the heart of Whispering Pines. The shock of the genetic match ripples through the task force like a sudden, unexpected electrical surge. The profile does not belong to a transient worker, or a violent offender with a public record. It points directly to an individual who has lived in the open as a respected, quiet pillar of the suburban community for his entire life. Richard Sterling, a 58-year-old retired middle school history teacher, a man who was 34 at the time of the abduction, and who lived less than 3 blocks from the Maple Grove pathway. He was a man who had taught the town's children, who had participated in the initial volunteer search parties in 2002, and who had spent decades living a life of absolute, mundane respectability, his lawn always perfectly manicured, his taxes pristine, his neighbors describing him as a gentle, solitary figure who spent his weekends volunteering at the local library. He had hidden in plain sight, using the quiet, predictable rhythm of suburban life to construct an impenetrable shield of innocence. But the most Chandong aspect of the 2026 investigation is not the DNA match itself. It is the sudden, unexpected emergence of a witness who has kept a terrifying, suffocating secret for 24 long years. Within 48 hours of the genetic match being flagged, the task force receives an anonymous call on their secure hotline. The voice is frail, trembling, and heavy with the dry, raspy cadence of a person who is reaching the end of their life. It is Eleanor Vance, a 78-year-old retired library clerk who worked the desk on the afternoon of October 12, 2002. She is currently receiving palliative care in a quiet hospice facility, and she has decided that she cannot close her eyes for the last time without releasing the dark, freezing memory that has haunted her dreams since the day Heather Drake vanished from the park. "I saw him," she whispers into the receiver, her voice cracking under the weight of 24 years of silent terror. "I was walking home through the Maple Grove about 10 minutes after Heather left the library. The path was quiet, but I heard a soft voice near the ancient oak tree. I looked through the leaves, and I saw Richard Sterling standing there. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't acting wild. He was speaking to her so gently, showing her a map or a book, and she smiled because she knew him. He was her history teacher. She trusted him. And then, in a single, quiet motion, he reached out, placed his hand over her mouth, and she went limp. He caught her, carried her into the deep brush, and then he returned to the path, picked up her backpack, and placed it neatly at the base of the oak. He looked straight at me, detective. He told me that if I ever breathed a word of what I saw, he would make sure my own grandchildren never came home from school. I was terrified. I locked my doors, I retired the next month, and I never spoke his name. But I can't die with this. I can't let him keep her in the dark forever." The confession of the unexpected witness, combined with the molecular reality of the touch DNA from the zipper pull, creates an iron circle of guilt from which there is no escape, no appeal, and no delay of justice. The geographic advantage that Richard Sterling had used to shield himself for decades has dissolved in real time, exposed as a hollow illusion by his own biological trace and the breaking silence of an old woman who refused to take his secret to her grave. At 5:15 a.m. on July 16, 2026, a caravan of unmarked black tactical vehicles, their lights cut to parking beams, pulls slowly onto the gravel driveway of Sterling's suburban home. The search teams move with a quiet, militaristic precision, their boots crunching softly on the wet pine needles as they surround the property. Within seconds, the front door is breached, the sharp, metallic crack of the entry team's tools echoing through the quiet, forested neighborhood like a rifle shot. Richard Sterling is pulled from his bed in his pajamas, his face pale, his eyes wide and vacant in the blinding glare of the tactical lights. He does not fight. He does not scream. He simply looks at the handcuffs clicking shut around his thin, wrinkled wrists with a look of quiet, absolute exhaustion, as if a part of him has been waiting for this exact, cold morning since the autumn of 2002. As the transport vehicle pulls away from the suburb, the news of the arrest sweeps through the town of Whispering Pines like a sudden, cleansing wind, bringing an end to the 24-year reign of the suburban shadow. The community is waking up to a reality where the mystery that had haunted their quiet streets is finally resolved, the long, dark road toward justice reaching its final, unalterable phase, and the silence of the 2002 cold case broken once and for all by the cold, unyielding voice of the truth. The heavy steel-reinforced doors of the transport van slammed shut with a sharp, pneumatic hiss, sealing Richard Sterling inside a dark, windowless vault of corrugated iron and cold polymer. It was 5:30 a.m. on July 16, 2026. Outside, the pristine, master-planned streets of Whispering Pines were still draped in the damp, blue-gray shadows of early morning. A light, freezing fog hung over the manicured lawns and the white picket fences, clinging to the heavy branches of the maple grove that had harbored the town's darkest secret for 24 years. Inside the vehicle, there was only the low, vibrating roar of the diesel engine and the rhythmic, metallic clinking of the transport chain secured to Sterling's waist belt. The retired history teacher sat completely motionless, his back pressed against the metal ribbing of the side wall, his eyes staring blankly into the absolute darkness. For nearly a quarter of a century, he had lived with the absolute, unshakable belief that he had constructed a perfect, permanent barrier between his quiet, respected suburban life and the damp, leaf-strewn earth of the Maple Grove. He had watched his students grow up, attended community block parties, and even stood in the local library where Heather Drake spent her final hours, feeling a secret, cold surge of absolute superiority every time the local media ran a retrospective on the Maple Grove disappearance. But now, the geographic and temporal shield he had relied upon for more than half his life had been shattered in a single, silent instant, dismantled not by a sudden failure of his own vigilance, but by the microscopic, unyielding memory of a world that had grown too smart to let him hide. The transport vehicle pulled into the secure, subterranean garage of the State Police Division headquarters in Columbus, the heavy steel security grates closing behind it with a loud, echoing clang that sounded like a definitive, mechanical punctuation mark. The doors of the van swung open, revealing the bright, sterile glare of the intake bay, where a team of 3 high-security custody officers stood waiting in the cold air. Sterling was lifted down from the vehicle, his movements stiff, hesitant, and fragile, his thin, 58-year-old frame seeming to have shrunk under the weight of his exposure. He was led down a long, white-tiled corridor toward the high-security booking desk, the rhythmic, metallic clink of his ankle shackles echoing off the concrete walls with a hollow, depressing cadence. He did not look at the officers. He did not look at the digital cameras tracking his progress from the ceiling. His eyes remained fixed on the gray linoleum floor, his jaw working silently as if he were trying to swallow a dry, dusty stone. The comfortable, predictable warmth of his suburban home, the scent of fresh coffee, The quiet mornings tending to his rose bushes, the polite, neighborly waves from people who believed he was a gentle, eccentric educator, had been permanently erased, replaced by the sterile, clinical reality of a state-level capital murder prosecution. At the end of the corridor, the heavy steel door of interrogation room B clicked open, its magnetic latch releasing with a sharp, pneumatic hiss. Inside, the air was cold, static, and thick with the faint scent of industrial ozone and old paper. The room was empty except for a heavy, scuffed metal table bolted directly to the floor, 2 matching steel chairs, and a high-definition recording system mounted in the corner of the ceiling, its tiny red light blinking with a steady, quiet frequency that seemed to track the final, inevitable countdown of Sterling's freedom. Sitting on the far side of the table was Detective Sergeant Joanna West, her eyes red and bloodshot from a lack of sleep that had now stretched into its 3rd continuous day. Beside her, resting his hands flat on a thick, blue plastic document binder, was Detective Lieutenant Raymond Vance. He was 71 years old, his hair stark, snowy white, his face lined with the deep, exhausting gravity of a 24-year vigil. He had retired from active duty years earlier, but he had never truly left the case. He had kept a duplicate copy of Heather Drake's file in his personal study, looking at her smiling, 16-year-old face every single morning before he went to sleep, waiting for the day when the progress of the world would finally allow him to look her abductor in the eye. "Sit down, Richard," Raymond Vance began, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that carried no theatricality, only the flat, crushing authority of a man who had spent a lifetime waiting to deliver this exact sentence. He did not wait for the suspect to adjust to the cold metal of the chair. He did not offer him a cup of water or a blanket to shield him from the chill of the room. He simply opened the blue binder, exposing a fresh, high-resolution digital print of the blue canvas backpack that had been recovered from the base of the hollow oak tree on the night of October 12, 2002. In 2002, when you walked away from that maple grove, you believed you had played a perfect game against a primitive system. You looked at the dry, hard ground, you saw the wind blowing the autumn leaves over the path, and you believed the earth was washing you clean along with them. You didn't leave a single fingerprint on her books, her running shoes, or her portable CD player. You wore your heavy, rubber-insulated gardening gloves, ensuring that the friction of your skin would never touch a surface we could dust. But you didn't think about the physics of the zipper, Richard. You didn't think about the tension pull. Sterling did not raise his head, his hands remaining locked in the heavy steel anchor ring in the center of the table, his fingers twitching in a rapid, nervous rhythm against his lap. "I don't know anything about a backpack," he whispered, his voice so thin and dry it sounded like paper scraping across concrete. "I was a history teacher, detective. I handled thousands of items every day. You're trying to turn a random, casual contact into an abduction charge because you have no other explanation for an old file. I never met Heather Drake outside of the classroom. I never walked into that grove on that afternoon. If my DNA is on that bag, it's because it was a school-issued item or because I handled it during a class activity. It's a mistake. The computers are making a mistake. The computer doesn't have an imagination, Richard, and it doesn't make mistakes in the double helix," Detective West said, her voice sharp, clinical, and completely devoid of hesitation as she leaned forward, her forearms flat on the table. In 2002, the forensic teams were looking at the exterior buckles of that backpack, believing the assailant must have gripped them to carry the bag. They found nothing but Heather's own faint, dust-damaged prints. But they didn't understand the kinetics of the object. To close that specific model of heavy-duty canvas bag and pull the zipper tight, you had to press your bare thumb and forefinger directly against a tiny, synthetic weave of the fabric surrounding the main zipper pull, a highly protected, internal friction zone that is completely shielded from the direct action of the wind and the rain by the surrounding storm flap. When you gripped that pull, your skin cells were transferred under intense physical pressure into the microscopic grooves of the nylon fibers. They didn't blow away in the wind. They were frozen in time, preserved in a dry, anaerobic pocket for 24 years until the Oakhaven Protocol vacuum swabbed them out. The DNA we extracted from that zipper pull belongs to you, Richard. The probability of that profile belonging to any other man on this continent is 1 in 98 billion. The science has already stripped you of your alibi. The only thing you have left to decide is how you want to face the rest of this morning. The mention of the zipper pull seemed to act like a physical blow to Sterling's chest. His shoulders slumped further, his chin dropping closer to his collar as if the very weight of his own head had become too much to bear. The polished, quiet persona of the harmless, intellectual schoolteacher was beginning to spiderweb with deep, structural cracks, leaving behind nothing but the raw, shivering carcass of a predator who had finally been run to ground by his own biological signature. For nearly a quarter of a century, he had lived with the absolute, comforting certainty that he had beaten the system. He had watched the local police departments of the early 2000s fail, watched the media coverage dry up, and even walked past the Maple Grove pathway on his way to his backyard, feeling a dark, secret surge of godlike superiority as he watched the local children playing under the ancient trees. He had prepared himself for every possible investigative angle: fingerprints, witnesses, security cameras, tire tracks, but he had never prepared for a future where the air he breathed and the skin he shed would stay behind in the dark to name him. Let's talk about the afternoon of October 12th, 2002, Richard, Raymond Vance said, sliding a yellowed, handwritten school activity log across the table. The pages were covered in neat, precise columns of numbers, documenting the teacher attendance records of Whispering Pines Middle School from the autumn of 2002. Your alibi for that afternoon was that you were conducting an after-school history club meeting in room 114, 3 blocks north of the library. You signed the log at 3:30 p.m., and you signed it again at 5 p.m., claiming you never left the classroom during those 90 minutes. It was a beautiful alibi, Richard. It was backed by the chaotic, unmonitored nature of the school's elective hours, where students wandered in and out without a formal roll call. But we didn't just check the logbooks this time. We ran a digital reconstruction of the cellular network pings from the old towers that operated near Oak Street on that exact afternoon. Sterling's eyes flickered toward the logbook, his jaw tightening as he recognized his own youthful, aggressive signature on the faded paper. The history club was real, he muttered, his voice dropping to a low, defensive rasp. The students were there. They watched me grade papers. You can't change the records just because it fits your theory. The history club was real, Richard, but you weren't in that classroom between 4 p.m. and 4:45 p.m., Detective West said, tapping her tablet to display a digital rendering of the town's cellular grid on the wall monitor. We recovered the archived tower logs from the network carrier's long-term cold storage, data that was preserved on magnetic tape cartridges, but never analyzed in connection with Heather's disappearance. The tower logs show a series of registration pings from your personal mobile phone, a Nokia model you owned in 2002. At exactly 4:18 p.m., your phone did not ping the tower adjacent to the school. It pinged the microsector antenna mounted directly on top of the public library on Oak Street. You were moving south, Richard. You were tracking her path. You left the classroom through the rear fire exit, knowing the hallway cameras had a blind spot near the boiler room. You didn't walk 3 blocks through the open streets. You used the dense tree-line of the Maple Grove. You ran through the shadows, through the dry leaves, because you knew the local patrol cars were focused on the main school crossing. You came out of the trees like a phantom. You did your work, and you went back to your classroom before the late bus students even cleared the parking lot. The sheer, detached calculation of the methodology was a silent, suffocating presence in the interrogation room. Sterling had not been driven by a sudden, uncontrollable surge of passion or a manic, chaotic impulse. He had approached the abduction of Heather Drake with the same structural, logistical precision he used to organize his historical archives. He had calculated the blind spots of the school cameras, the timing of the library's shift changes, the density of the tree-line in the grove, and the speed of a teenager's walking pace, turning the quiet, peaceful park of Whispering Pines into his private, physical corridor of assault. He believed that his knowledge of the town's geography would protect him forever, that the natural world would act as his accomplice, using the falling autumn leaves to cover his tracks and the thick, silent canopy of the maples to keep his face hidden from the eyes of the community. But you weren't alone in that grove, Richard, Raymond Vance said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was almost a hiss. He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto the suspect's face with a predatory intensity that made the old teacher draw back against his seat. You thought you had selected the perfect time. You saw the quiet path keeping the park empty, and you saw the dense branches blocking the light from the street lamps. But you forgot to look back toward the library pathway. You forgot to look at the clearing near the ancient oak tree. Eleanor Vance was standing there, Richard. She was watching you. She was watching her colleague, the respected history teacher, stand over a 16-year-old girl in a dark wool coat. Sterling's left eyelid twitched, a tiny, involuntary spasm that was instantly captured by the high-definition camera in the corner of the ceiling. Eleanor was old, he whispered, his voice cracking with a sudden, sharp register of panic. She was confused. She had vision problems. She didn't see anything. She lived in this town for 24 years and never said a word to the police. You're trying to use the delusions of a dying woman to build a case out of nothing. She didn't say a word because you threatened to murder her grandchildren, Richard, Detective West said, her voice carrying a cold, clinical fury that made the air in the room feel thin, almost suffocating. You knew her grandchildren attended the very middle school where you taught, the very classrooms where you had complete, unmonitored authority. You told her that if she ever breathed a word of what she saw through the trees, her family would pay the ultimate price, and it would be written off as a tragic, playground accident. You used her love for her family as a physical cage to keep her silent for 24 years. But her grandchildren are grown now, Richard. They live 3 states away, completely outside of your reach. The cage is open, and she has decided that she is not going to take your secret to her grave. West reached out and pressed a button on her tablet, activating a small, portable speaker that sat in the center of the metal table. The speaker let out a brief, static-filled hum, and then the voice of Eleanor Vance filled the sterile interrogation room, a voice that was frail, trembling, and dry as dead leaves, but holding a raw, unyielding clarity that sounded like a voice speaking from beyond the grave. He wore his dark green hunting jacket. The recording played, the old woman's breath catching on the words as she spoke from her hospice bed. The one with the brown corduroy collar that he always wore when he was volunteering at the library. I saw him walk up to Heather. She didn't run from him. She stopped because she knew him. He was her history teacher. She had seen him in the hallways every day. He spoke to her for just a second, showing her something in his hand, and then he reached out, placed his hand over her mouth, and she went limp. He didn't drop her. He caught her so gently, like he was carrying a bundle of books, and carried her into the deep brush. And then he returned to the path, picked up her blue backpack, and placed it neatly at the base of the oak. He looked straight at me, Detective. His face was bright under the setting sun. It was Richard. I know it was him. I've seen that face in my nightmares every night for 24 years. The recording fell silent, the static-filled hum of the speaker, the only sound marking the transition from the old woman's memory to the cold reality of the interrogation room. Sterling sat frozen, his hands still cuffed to the table, his face completely pale, his eyes wide and vacant, as if he were staring at a ghost that had just walked through the concrete wall. The psychological compartments where he had stored the memories of his parallel existence had suffered a total, catastrophic structural failure, the secrets of his suburban execution spilling out into the clinical light of the 21st century, brought down by a single, dust-shielded zipper pull and the breaking silence of a 78-year-old woman who had refused to let him keep her in the dark. Outside the precinct, the early morning fog had turned into a light, shimmering drizzle that coated the police cruisers and the media vans in a thin, pristine layer of silver. The news of the Whispering Pines arrest was already flashing across every digital television screen in the region, the headline screaming of the suburban shadow's total, spectacular collapse. The community was waking up to a reality that was completely, permanently altered. A reality where the shadow that had lived in their quiet streets for 24 years was finally and permanently brought into the light of day. The long, dark road toward justice had reached its final, unalterable phase, and the silence of the 2002 cold case was about to be broken once and for all by the cold, unyielding voice of the court. The metallic click of the tablet's mute button echoed in the small concrete confines of interrogation room, be like a gunshot. It was 6:02 a.m. on July 16, 2026. The voice of Eleanor Vance, preserved with pristine, digital clarity on the recording, seemed to linger in the cold air, a spectral presence that had just shattered 24 years of manufactured suburban safety. Richard Sterling sat perfectly still, his hands cuffed to the steel ring in the center of the table, his fingers trembling in a slow, involuntary vibration. He did not look up. The carefully maintained mask of the gentle, intellectual history teacher, the man who had spent decades guiding the children of Whispering Pines through the dry, safe archives of the past, was peeling away, revealing the raw, shivering panic of a cornered predator. Detective Lieutenant Raymond Vance leaned forward, his snowy white hair catching the harsh glare of the fluorescent tubes. He did not rush to break the silence. He let the weight of the old woman's words press down on Sterling, allowing the reality of his total exposure to sink into the marrow of his bones. "She kept your secret, Richard," Raymond said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that carried the crushing authority of a 24-year vigil. "She kept it because she loved her family. She watched her grandchildren play in the neighborhood park, knowing that their history teacher, the man who graded their papers and stood beside them at the school crossing, was a phantom who could make a child disappear in broad daylight without leaving a single trace. But you made a fundamental error, Richard. You calculated the speed of the children, the blind spots of the security cameras, and the timing of the library shifts, but you forgot to calculate the simple, relentless passage of time. Her grandchildren are grown now. They live 3 states away, entirely outside of your reach. The leverage you used to build your sanctuary has dissolved. And now, all she has left is her conscience and a video-recorded deposition signed by a high court judge." Sterling's breathing had become shallow, a rapid, whistling sound coming from his throat as his chest rose and fell beneath his wet flannel shirt. He desperately tried to find a foothold, a logical path of retreat to salvage his alibi. "Eleanor was 3 blocks away," he muttered, his voice cracking as he reached for a defensive argument. "It was autumn. It was twilight. The shadows in the maple grove were heavy, and she was an old woman who already wore thick glasses. Any defense attorney in this county will tell you that an eyewitness identification under those lighting conditions from 24 years ago is completely worthless. It's a performance, detective. You're trying to turn the desperate imagination of a dying woman into a capital murder case because you have nothing else. If it were just Eleanor's eyes, Richard, you might have a chance to slip through the net." Detective Sergeant Joanna West intervened, her voice cold, flat, and entirely devoid of emotion. She flipped open the blue plastic document binder, turning to a page displaying a highly detailed, multicolored genetic alignment graph. "But we don't build cases on memories alone anymore. We build them on the molecular reality of your own body. The touch DNA we recovered from the synthetic fabric surrounding the main zipper pull of Heather's backpack isn't a vague shadow or a subjective recollection. It is a mathematical signature. It's an 16-marker genetic match that places you directly at the scene, with your bare hand on the very object used to conceal her disappearance. When you combine that with her testimony, your personal mobile phone tower pings, and the forged school attendance log, you aren't looking at a trial, Richard. You're looking at a clinical, systematic demolition of your life." Sterling looked down at the genetic graph, the high, colorful peaks of the DNA markers standing out against the white paper like a series of clean, digital daggers. The public defender sitting beside him did not reach for his pen. He did not flip through his legal pad to draft an objection. The lawyer's posture had shifted from defensive alertness to a quiet, professional resignation. He knew that in 2026, under the unyielding parameters of the Oakhaven Protocol, there was no legal maneuver that could dismantle a case where the biology of the suspect was physically embedded inside the mechanics of the crime scene. "Why the backpack, Richard?" Raymond Vance asked, his voice softening just a fraction, not out of sympathy, but out of a deep, historical curiosity that had haunted him for half his life. "That was the detail that kept us awake for 24 years. You didn't take her money. You didn't take her jewelry. Her silver locket was still on her person. You laid her backpack neatly at the base of the hollow oak tree, zipped tight, as if she had just stepped away for a moment. Was it because you couldn't bear to look at what you had done, or was it because you wanted to make sure the wind didn't scatter her things before the morning? Sterling's fingers twitched violently against his lap, the metal links of his handcuffs clinking sharply against the anchor ring with a dry, metallic rattle. He closed his eyes, his head dropping back down toward his chest, as if the light in the room had suddenly become too bright to face. The memory of that autumn afternoon in 2002, the smell of the damp earth, the gold leaves drifting through the trees, the soft, yielding weight of the young girl as she went limp in his arms, was no longer a secret he could manage inside the quiet compartments of his mind. It was a physical landscape that the police had excavated, mapped, and laid out on the metal table in front of him. "It was the wind," Sterling whispered, his voice so quiet and dry it was barely captured by the high-definition microphone in the ceiling. "The wind in the maple grove never stops in October. It blows the leaves across the paths, it shakes the branches, it scatters everything. I knew that if I left her bag open, the wind would blow her books away, her papers would get wet in the dew, and it would destroy the quiet. I wanted her to stay just the way she was when she stopped breathing. Perfect. Untouched by the town, the backpack. It was a marker, a neat, quiet marker to keep her space organized until someone who cared enough could find her." The cold-blooded, possessive delusion of his words sent a sudden, freezing draft through the interrogation room, a realization of the extreme, clinical sociopathy that had allowed this man to live in the open for 24 years without ever showing a single sign of remorse. He did not view Heather Drake as a human being with a family, a future, and a life of her own. He viewed her as a structural object to be managed, preserved, and protected from the elements, using his knowledge of the town's geography and school schedules to execute her abduction with the same precision he used to organize his history lessons. Outside the precinct, the early morning fog had turned into a light, shimmering drizzle that coated the police cruisers and the media vans in a thin, pristine layer of silver. The news of the Whispering Pines arrest was already flashing across every digital television screen in the region, the headlines screaming of the suburban shadow's total, spectacular collapse. The community was waking up to a reality that was completely, permanently altered. A reality where the shadow that had lived in their quiet streets for 24 years was finally and permanently brought into the light of day. The long, dark road toward justice had reached its final, unalterable phase, and the silence of the 2002 cold case was about to be broken once and for all by the cold, unyielding voice of the court. Inside Room B, the digital recorder spun on, its tiny red light blinking with a steady, quiet frequency that seemed to mark the final, inevitable countdown of Richard Sterling's freedom. The interview was formally suspended at 6:45 a.m. as the custody team entered to prepare the suspect for his transfer to the high-security wing of the state correctional facility. He stood up slowly, his joints popping in the quiet of the room, his movements fragile and hesitant, the transition from the powerful, untouchable history teacher to a convicted capital kidnapper almost complete. He did not look at Raymond Vance as they led him out, his head bowed, his gray sweatpants dragging on the scuffed linoleum floor. Raymond Vance remained at the table for a long time after the door had closed, his hand resting on the thick, blue document binder. He could hear the low, steady hum of the precinct's ventilation system, a sound that had once signaled the cold, frustrating dead ends of his youth, but now sounded like a clean, drenching release. The 24-year-old cold case had not just ended in an arrest, it had dissolved under the unyielding, microscopic focus of a new era of justice, leaving the memory of the young track star who had vanished in 2002 finally, and permanently, safe in the light of day. The metallic clink of the security latch on Interrogation Room B's heavy door echoed through the observation corridor, sounding like a dry bone snapping in the early morning quiet. It was 6:47 a.m. on July 16, 2026. Outside the reinforced concrete walls of the State Police Division headquarters in Columbus, the freezing rain continued to slick the surface of the asphalt, transforming the surrounding highway networks into a gray, shimmering mirror. The dawn had arrived without light, bringing only a thick, stagnant fog that crawled out of the Scioto River basin to drape itself over the high-security fences and the satellite dishes of the media trucks idling at the perimeter gates. Inside the narrow, glass-paneled observation booth overlooking the interrogation room, Detective Lieutenant Raymond Vance stood in the dark, his hands flat against the cold surface of the pane, his eyes tracking the slow, deflated exit of Richard Sterling. The 71-year-old retired detective did not move, his body held in a rigid, hyper-focused stillness that had been his default posture since the cold autumn afternoon of October 12, 2002. Beside him, the high-resolution digital monitors of the Oak Haven Protocol workstation hummed with a low, clinical frequency, their screens casting a pale, simulated blue glow over his weathered face. The digital tracking vectors, molecular graphs, and historical cellular maps that had spent the night dissecting the suspect's life were now undergoing an automated, permanent backup sequence, their data packets migrating to the state's secure cloud archives. The transport deputies are taking him to the holding block on the lower level, Raymond, Detective Sergeant Joanna West said, her voice dropping to a quiet, flat whisper that barely registered above the steady drone of the computer cooling fans. She stood at the primary console, her fingers moving across the keys with a rapid, mechanical precision that had become second nature over the last 72 hours of the dragnet. The county prosecutor has already prepared the preliminary arraignment documents. They are filing the first-degree kidnapping and capital murder charges at 9 a.m. There will be no bail, no media access, and no delays. The state wants him in the high-security processing queue before the new news cycle begins. Raymond did not look back at her. His focus remained fixed on the empty metal chair inside Room B, the scuffed surface of the table still reflecting the white glare of the fluorescent tubes. "We spent 24 years looking for a ghost, Joanna," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that carried the damp, physical exhaustion of his long vigil. "We looked at the transient shelters, we checked the registration of every out-of-state commercial truck that passed through the county, we dragged the lake, and we spent hundreds of hours interviewing travelers on the interstate. We were looking for a monster who came from the outside, a predator who came off the highway, snatched her from the path, and vanished back into the empty spaces of the Midwest. But he was sitting in the library. He was grading papers. He was standing on his porch, watching the searchlights sweep the trees, and he was offering us coffee while we looked for her bones." "The proximity was his primary shield, Raymond," West replied, leaning her shoulder against the glass partition. "In 2002, the investigative paradigm was entirely linear. You looked for a clear, logical rupture in the victim's routine, a broken window, a forced entry, a struggle on the path, or a suspicious vehicle idling near the scene. But Sterling didn't rupture her routine. He integrated himself directly into it. He knew which books she was researching, he knew the exact minute she walked out of the library, and he knew that her trust in him as her educator would prevent her from running when he stepped out of the maple grove. The local police forces of that era couldn't see him because they were looking for a friction point, but there was no friction. There was only a quiet, polite conversation that ended in a silent struggle in the brush. The sheer, detached calculation of the suspect's methodology was a suffocating presence in the quiet command booth. For nearly a quarter of a century, Richard Sterling had lived with the absolute, comforting certainty that his respectability was a permanent, unassailable barrier against the curiosity of the law. He had watched the initial panic of the suburbs subside, watched the local school board implement new security protocols for the student paths, and watched the high school track team establish a permanent memorial scholarship in Heather Drake's name, feeling a secret, cold surge of absolute, godlike superiority every time he attended a graduation ceremony. He had prepared himself for every possible traditional police technique: fingerprints, door-to-door canvas interviews, vehicle tracking, and neighborhood gossip, but he had never anticipated a future where his own microscopic skin cells, preserved in the dry synthetic weave of a zipper pull, would rise from the dark to strip him of his life. "The ground-penetrating radar units are already on site at the Maple Grove site, Raymond," West said, tapping her screen to display a split-screen video feed from the county search team. "The park has been cordoned off by 30 state patrol vehicles. The technicians are targeting the root system of the ancient oak tree where the backpack was recovered, specifically the deep, sandy clay pockets within a 20-yard radius of the trunk. Sterling's family owned a residential excavation company in the early 90s, and the land records show that he had access to a commercial backhoe that was parked on the edge of the park during the path reconstruction project in the autumn of 2002. He didn't just walk into the trees with a shovel, Raymond. He had the machinery. He used his construction access to dig his vaults in broad daylight, Joanna, Raymond whispered, his hand tightening into a fist against the glass. He was the historic preservation coordinator for the town council. He spent the summer of 2002 mapping the old root systems of the grove, advising the county on how to pave the pathways without damaging the ancient oaks. He knew every square inch of that earth. He knew where the clay was thick enough to seal out the moisture, and he knew which trees would remain undisturbed by future city construction for the next 50 years. He was using his professional authority to select his burial sites before he even chose his target. The digital terminal on West's desk suddenly let out a sharp, double-tone alert, the screen flashing with a high-contrast amber border that signaled an immediate, high-priority update from the State Forensic Anthropology Laboratory in Columbus. She leaned in closer, her eyes scanning the raw data streams that were rapidly populating the central window. It was a secondary molecular alignment report, not from the zipper pull of the canvas backpack, but from a degraded, soil-stained leather gardening glove that had been recovered from a locked wooden chest in Sterling's basement during the initial search warrant execution. The analysis was a devastating, clinical continuation of the suspect's biological trail. Using advanced vacuum-assisted microswabbing and low-template DNA extraction, the lab technicians had swept the interior fingers of the glove, recovering a mixture of the suspect's own epithelial cells and a second, highly degraded biological profile that had remained protected from the natural acidity of the soil by the treated leather. Within 90 seconds of the genetic sequence being uploaded to the ancestral DNA network, the system returned a 99.999% genetic alignment. Profile match, Sarah Vance. The match was an absolute, unassailable lock. Sarah Vance, again, no relation to Raymond, was a 14-year-old middle school student who had vanished from a public park in the neighboring suburb of Oak Ridge in September of 1999, 3 years before the abduction of Heather Drake. Her case had been treated as an unsolved runaway investigation for over 2 decades, the local sheriff's department believing she had boarded an interstate bus after a family dispute, her file quietly sliding into the same dark archives that had held Heather's memory. The realization of the dual abductions made Raymond Vance feel a sudden, physical tightness in his chest, a sensation of the ground shifting beneath his boots as the scope of the case expanded from a single, localized cold case into a systematic, multi-suburb campaign of calculated violence. The red lines connecting Richard Sterling to the quiet neighborhoods of the county were no longer a theoretical reconstruction. They were a permanent, molecular map of horror that had been written, signed, and preserved by the suspect's own hands. He was hunting along the entire school transit corridor, Joanna, Raymond said, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly whisper that carried the deep, historical anger of his long career. Oak Ridge in 1999, Whispering Pines in 2002. He was moving from suburb to suburb, selecting his targets from the students who walked the quiet green spaces between the schools and the libraries. He didn't use a vehicle. He didn't use a weapon. He used his status as their teacher, their neighbor, their protector, to get close enough to silence them in seconds. He was a collector of lives. And he kept his records, West added, pulling up a digitized scan of a personal journal recovered from Sterling's study. Look at this entry from September 14, 1999, the exact afternoon Sarah Vance vanished. He wrote, "The soil in the valley is changing. The clay is heavy, but the sand near the creek is clean. It holds the shape of the spade without collapsing." He was documenting his soil tests, Raymond. He was analyzing the physical properties of the earth on the very day he took her, treating the burial of a 14-year-old girl with the same scientific detachment he used to catalog his history archives. The precision of the forensic sweep had completely transformed the nature of the investigation from a traditional, narrative-based search into a high-velocity, biological tracking operation. In the early days of the cold case, in the winter of 2002 and the dark years of 1999, the police had been forced to rely on the fragile, subjective memories of witnesses, the unreliable tips of informants, and the physical limitations of search dogs in the rain. They had been playing a game of chance against a predator who had designed his crimes to exploit those exact limitations. But in 2026, the game had changed. The investigators had bypassed the human element entirely, relying on the quiet, unyielding memory of the physical world, the microscopic, protein-protected biological signatures that Sterling had left behind in the air, on the metal, and in the fabric of his crimes. Outside the precinct, the early morning rain had turned into a light, shimmering mist that coated the police cruisers and the media vans in a thin, pristine layer of silver. The news of the Whispering Pines arrest was already flashing across every digital television screen in the region, the headlines screaming of the suburban shadow's total, spectacular collapse. The community was waking up to a reality that was completely, permanently altered. A reality where the shadow that had lived in their quiet streets for 24 years was finally and permanently brought into the light of day. The long, dark road toward justice had reached its final, unalterable phase, and the silence of the 2002 cold case was about to be broken once and for all by the cold, unyielding voice of the court. Inside Room B, the digital recorder spun on, its tiny red light blinking with a steady, quiet frequency that seemed to mark the final, inevitable countdown of Richard Sterling's freedom. The interview was formally suspended at 7:15 a.m. as the custody team entered to prepare the suspect for his transfer to the high-security holding block. He stood up slowly, his joints popping in the quiet of the room, his movements fragile and hesitant, the transition from the powerful, untouchable history teacher to a convicted capital kidnapper almost complete. He did not look at Raymond Vance as they led him out, his head bowed, his gray sweatpants dragging on the scuffed linoleum floor. Raymond Vance remained at the table for a long time after the door had closed, his hand resting on the thick, blue document binder. He could hear the low, steady hum of the precinct's ventilation system, a sound that had once signaled the cold, frustrating dead ends of his youth, but now sounded like a clean, drenching release. The 24-year-old cold case had not just ended in an arrest, it had dissolved under the unyielding, microscopic focus of a new era of justice, leaving the memory of the young track star who had vanished in 2002 finally, and permanently, safe in the light of day. The freezing rain rolling off the Scioto River basin did not bring a clean release to the quiet, tree-lined cul-de-sacs of Whispering Pines. It only exposed the cold, glistening grime of the suburban landscape under a leaden morning sky. It was 7:15 a.m. on July 16, 2026. A convoy of specialized forensic utility vehicles and unmarked police cruisers sat idling at the primary entrance of the Maple Grove pedestrian pathway on Oak Street. The yellow crime scene tape, stretched taut across the historic stone pillars marking the entrance to the park, fluttered violently in the biting wind. 24 years after Heather Drake's blue canvas backpack was discovered resting neatly at the base of the hollow oak, the physical space she had walked through during her final minutes was once again the focal point of a massive, high-velocity criminal investigation. But this time, the investigators were not stumbling through the brush with primitive flashlights and chalk. They were armed with the clinical, digital precision of a future that refused to let the past remain buried. Inside the mobile command vehicle parked at the curb, Detective Sergeant Joanna West adjusted her headset, her eyes locked onto the real-time telemetry streams flowing from the search teams deployed at Richard Sterling's suburban property. The Oak Haven Protocol was operating at maximum bandwidth, coordinating the multi-agency dragnet that was currently dissecting the retired history teacher's life with the speed of an automated system. The search warrant executed at his ranch-style home had already yielded its first, devastating biological markers, but the tactical focus was now shifting to the physical materials stored inside the dry, cedar-scented crawlspace beneath his residential tool shed. The ground-penetrating radar units have identified a distinct density anomaly beneath the concrete foundation of the tool shed, West said, her voice dropping to a low, quiet pitch that cut through the static of the radio. She was speaking directly to Detective Lieutenant Raymond Vance, who stood at the edge of the police cordon in the Maple Grove, his white hair damp with the freezing mist. The anomaly is approximately 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, and located at a depth of 4 feet. It's consistent with a structured excavation, a localized disturbance in the natural glacial till of the valley that has been covered with a layer of poured, modern concrete. We are preparing to bring in the concrete cutters to breach the slab. Tell them to move slowly, Joanna, Raymond Vance replied, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that was almost swallowed by the distant hum of the morning highway traffic. He pulled his heavy wool coat tighter around his neck, his eyes scanning the historic maple trees where he had spent the best years of his youth chasing a phantom. Sterling didn't build that concrete slab to support his lawnmower. He's an educator who studied historic preservation. He understands the structural properties of cement. He knew that a poured concrete cap would block the scent from tracking dogs, prevent water intrusion from the seasonal water table, and keep his secrets insulated from the natural cycle of the earth. He built a tomb inside his own workspace, believing the concrete would hold his silence forever. The physical reality of the investigation was moving with a Don Dapp, relentless momentum that left no room for the defense team to construct a narrative of doubt. While the tactical teams on the island prepared to cut through the concrete slab, the forensic laboratory in Columbus was completing its secondary, high-resolution processing of the material recovered from the leather gardening gloves seized from Sterling's basement. The discovery of Sarah Vance's DNA on the interior lining of the glove had already shattered his suburban alibi for the 1999 disappearance, but the molecular biologists were now searching for the microscopic traces of other victims who might have been carried into the dark, hidden spaces of his property. Using vacuum-assisted microswabs and highly localized chemical extraction, the lab technicians swept the interior seams of the heavy leather glove, a highly protected, dry environment that had remained insulated from the corrosive action of moisture and the heavy acidity of the soil. The porous, fibrous nature of the leather acted as a natural trap for microscopic biological material, absorbing the friction-transferred skin cells of anyone who had been placed inside his vehicle or carried through the brush. Within 3 hours of continuous genetic sequencing, the laboratory's computer terminals began to populate with a series of distinct, high-contrast DNA profiles, each one representing a different, unresolved missing persons file from the regional transit corridors between 1997 and 2004. The digital monitors displayed the genetic peak markers in a series of colorful, jagged graphs that left no room for scientific debate. It was a molecular registry of a predator's career, a clean, mathematical ledger of violence that matched 3 separate, unsolved abductions: a 15-year-old student who had vanished from a school bus stop in a neighboring township in the spring of 1998, an 18-year-old retail worker who had disappeared after her late-shift closure on the suburban transit line in August of 2001, and a 20-year-old college student whose last known location was the public library parking lot in the winter of 2003. The probability of these profiles belonging to anyone other than the missing victims was 1 in 94 billion, creating an unassailable biological lock that pinned the retired history teacher directly to a systematic, decade-long campaign of geographic abductions. The sheer, cold-blooded methodology of Sterling's operations was a silent, suffocating presence in the West Precinct bullpen. He had not been a chaotic, impulsive killer who acted on a sudden, uncontrollable surge of rage. He had approached the abductions with the same structural, logistical precision he used to organize his historical archives. He calculated the blind spots of the school cameras, the timing of the library's shift changes, the density of the treeline in the grove, and the speed of a teenager's walking pace, turning the quiet, peaceful park of Whispering Pines into his private, physical corridor of assault. He believed that the complexity of his calculations would protect him forever, that the natural world would act as his accomplice, using the falling autumn leaves to cover his tracks and the thick, silent canopy of the maples to keep his face hidden from the eyes of the community. But the progress of the world had outrun his calculations. The Oakhaven Protocol had successfully bridged the gap between different eras of law enforcement, creating a unified, digital timeline of violence that stretched from the early abductions of the late 90s to the execution of Heather Drake in 2002. The state prosecutor had already drafted a comprehensive, 30-page capital indictment, each count supported by a distinct, independent chain of biological and physical evidence. Inside the secure, fluorescent-lit attorney-client room of the King County Correctional Facility, Richard Sterling sat at the small metal table, his hands cuffed to the center ring, his public defender sitting beside him with his head bowed over the fresh forensic reports. The lawyer looked up, his face pale and lined with the deep, exhausting realization of a defeat that was absolute. He had spent his career defending some of the city's most notorious suspects, but he had never stood in front of a case where the biology of the offender was so completely, systematically woven into the mechanics of the crime scenes. "We have to talk about a plea, Richard," the attorney whispered, his voice dropping to a low, quiet register that did not carry to the guards standing outside the heavy iron door. "They have the DNA from the blue canvas backpack's zipper pull. They have the genetic matches from the leather gardening gloves in your basement. They have the cellular tower pings showing your mobile phone moving along the Maple Grove path on the afternoon Heather died, and within 30 minutes, the recovery teams on site are going to breach the concrete slab under your tool shed. If they find physical remains beneath that concrete, the state will seek a capital sentence, and we will have absolutely no line of defense that will survive a 5-minute cross-examination. This is the only window we are going to get to take the death penalty off the table." Sterling did not look at his lawyer. He kept his eyes fixed on the scuffed wooden surface of the table, his jaw working silently, as if he were rehearsing the phrases of his quiet, neighborly persona one last time. But the words would not come. The psychological compartment where he had hidden his dark desires had been completely, systematically hollowed out by the forensic team, leaving behind nothing but the cold, physical reality of his crimes. He looked up at the camera in the corner of the ceiling, his eyes wide and vacant, his voice dropping to a thin, raspy whisper that sounded like dry paper scraping across concrete. "The woods were always quiet," Sterling muttered, his shoulders slumping as the final reserves of his resistance collapsed. The town is so loud, so busy, so full of people who don't notice the trees changing or the leaves falling. I thought if I kept them in the grove, if I kept them under the earth, they would never have to see what the world does to people. I was their teacher, detective. I was the only one who cared enough to keep them perfect. I was keeping them mine." "You weren't their protector, Richard," Detective Sergeant West said, her voice cold, steady, and completely devoid of pity as she entered the room, carrying the completed plea agreement. She did not sit down. She stood at the end of the table, looking down at the suspect with an unyielding, clinical intensity. "You were their executioner. You stole their futures. You destroyed their families, and you left them in the dark for 24 years while you walked in the sun, taught our children, and pretended to be a respected member of this community. But the light has finally caught up with you. The science has named you. The earth has given them back, and your silence is officially over." The suspect did not answer. He slowly nodded his head, his hand trembling violently as his defense attorney guided his pen to the signature line of the plea agreement. With a few quick, scratching strokes of ink, the 24-year-old mystery of Whispering Pines was formally resolved, the signature of the killer joining the microscopic DNA sequence that had pursued him across the decades to finally demand a reckoning. As the documents were gathered and the detectives walked out into the cool morning air, the sirens of the suburbs and the rain of the valley seemed to merge into a single, quiet release of tension. The names of Heather Drake, Sarah Vance, and the other young women whose lives had been stolen along the quiet transit pathways were no longer just titles on faded, yellowed folders in a cold case unit. They were safe, written permanently into the historical record of justice, while the shadows that had held them for 24 years finally dissolved into the light of day. The concrete cutting saw in Richard Sterling's backyard in the quiet suburb of Whispering Pines roared to life at exactly 8:15 a.m., its high-pitched, metallic scream tearing through the damp, cold morning air and echoing off the towering maple trees that lined the property. It was the sound of a 24-year-old illusion of security being violently ripped apart. The freezing rain had ceased, leaving behind a thick, gelatinous mist that hung low over the manicured lawns, obscuring the distant rooftops of the neighboring houses. On the ground, Kneeling on the damp gravel outside the small cedar tool shed, 3 forensic technicians dressed in white Tyvek suits adjusted their heavy safety goggles and positioned the water-cooling line over the diamond-tipped blade of the saw. Detective Sergeant Joanna West stood just outside the blast radius of the gray concrete slurry, her arms crossed tightly over her tactical vest, her eyes fixed on the vibrating blade as it made its first deep, wet incision into the modern cement slab. Beside her stood the state's lead geological examiner, a man whose task was to analyze the compact glacial clay beneath the house, earth that had remained undisturbed since the suburban developers first graded the land, unless it had been violently rearranged by a human hand in the early 2000s. The slab is 4 inches thick, reinforced with welded wire mesh, the geologist said, his voice flat and clinical over the deafening roar of the saw. Sterling didn't pour this to support a lawnmower. This is highly strength commercial-grade cement, designed to cure rapidly and seal tightly against the high water table of the valley. If there is an organic deposit beneath the structure, the lack of oxygen and the constant, cold temperature of the underlying clay would act as a natural preservation chamber. It's the same principle as a deep limestone cavern. He built a structural envelope. West did not reply. She watched the gray water flow down the shallow drainage ditch toward the driveway, carrying with it the fine dust of the pulverized stone. For 24 years, Richard Sterling had walked over this very slab every single day to retrieve his gardening tools, his grass trimmers, and his historical reference books. He had stood on this concrete, breathing the clean morning air of the suburb, feeling the warmth of the summer sun, while keeping the dark, cold secrets of his parallel existence securely insulated beneath his boots. He had designed his home to be a monument to his respectability, a physical barrier that separated the polite, meticulous educator from the shadow who had stalked the quiet transit pathways of the county. The saw engine sputtered, groaned under a sudden increase in resistance, and then pitched higher as the blade broke through the bottom of the concrete layer, dropping into a soft, empty void beneath the steel mesh. The lead technician immediately cut the power, the sudden silence that rushed back into the yard feeling heavy, suffocating, and thick with the damp smell of wet earth and ancient decay. "We're through the cap," the technician announced, stepping back to lift the severed rectangular block of concrete with a pair of heavy-duty suction lifters. Beneath the stone lay a thick layer of black, industrial-grade plastic sheeting, its surface completely dry and free of the mud that should have accumulated from the surrounding soil. Sterling had wrapped the excavation like a commercial cargo shipment, utilizing his knowledge of structural preservation to ensure that no external water could penetrate the chamber and no internal gases could escape to alert the tracking dogs that had searched the perimeter of the grove in 2002. Using a sterile scalpel, the forensic specialist made a clean, cross-shaped incision through the heavy plastic, revealing a layer of fine, dry river sand, a material that did not exist naturally in the heavy, clay-rich soil of Whispering Pines. It was an imported matrix, selected for its neutral pH value and its high drainage capacity, designed to prevent the rapid, wet decay that would collapse the structural integrity of the soil above it. "He engineered the soil chemistry," Wes muttered, her voice dropping to a hard, freezing whisper as she stepped closer to the edge of the pit. She pulled her secure tablet from her vest pocket, activating the real-time link to the state forensic headquarters in Columbus. "Raymond, we've breached the concrete cap at the Whispering Pine site. We're looking at a multi-layered, engineered burial vault." The suspect didn't just dig a hole. He imported dry river sand and sealed the entire chamber in heavy-gauge polyethylene sheeting. The preservation level is going to be absolute. On the other side of the digital link, sitting in the quiet, sterile viewing gallery of the Columbus Medical Examiner's office, Detective Lieutenant Raymond Vance watched the live video feed on a high-definition monitor. His face was a pale, weathered mask of concentration, his hand gripping a cold cup of black coffee that had sat untouched on his desk for 3 hours. "The sand is the key, Joanna." Raymond's voice came through the speaker, low and gravelly, carrying the exhaustion of his 24-year pursuit. In 2002, during the reconstruction of the Historical Library Foundation, Sterling's company had the contract to clear the old riverbeds near the county line. He had hundreds of tons of that material at his disposal. He could carry it to his property in the back of his truck without anyone ever asking a single question. He was using the town's own resources to build his tombs. The extraction process began with a slow, meticulous hand-clearing of the sand, the technicians using small, plastic trowels and soft brushes to remove the granular layers scoop by scoop. Every grain of sand was passed through a series of fine mesh screens to capture any microtrace evidence, hair fibers, jewelry links, or personal buttons that might have slipped from the victims during the interment process. At the 22-inch level, the edge of a trowel struck a solid, unyielding surface that did not sound like stone or clay. It was the dull, flat thud of treated wood. The technicians shifted their focus, brushing away the remaining sand to reveal the top of a heavy, solid oak storage chest, its brass corners tarnished to a deep, dark green but its structure completely intact. The chest was fitted with 3 heavy-duty padlocks, their keyholes sealed with silicone caulk to prevent the intrusion of the surrounding soil. It was an object that looked less like a temporary coffin and more like a permanent, secure filing cabinet designed to protect valuable cargo from the decay of the earth. "We have a primary containment structure," the lead technician documented, his voice crackling through his respirator. "It is a vintage storage chest, constructed of solid oak with bronze reinforcement brackets. The dimensions are 48 inches in length, 24 inches in width, and 24 inches in depth. The exterior is dry, and there is no evidence of structural collapse or wood rot due to the protective action of the sand and the plastic wrapping." Using a heavy bolt cutter, the technicians severed the brass padlocks one by one, the sharp, metallic clink of the breaking metal sounding like a physical release of tension in the quiet yard. The lid of the chest was lifted slowly, its heavy brass hinges creaking with a dry, hollow sound that had not been heard since the autumn of 1999. Inside, wrapped in a thick, dry wool blanket that had preserved its vibrant red color, were the remains of Sarah Vance, the 14-year-old girl who had vanished from the Oak Ridge Park 27 years ago. Her clothing, the school varsity jacket with her initials embroidered on the chest, the denim jeans, and the small leather boots, were completely intact, the synthetic fibers resisting the passage of time in the dry, anaerobic environment of the sealed chest. The sight of the varsity jacket, its red and white wool still bright against the dark wood of the chest, made Wes draw a sharp, painful breath. She had spent the last 72 hours studying the digital folders of Sarah's life, looking at her school portraits, reading the desperate diaries her parents had kept until they passed away, and analyzing the coordinate maps of the suburban transit routes. To see those abstract elements of a stolen life condensed into a physical, red wool jacket in an oak chest was a devastating reminder of the calculated, cold-blooded reality of Richard Sterling's methodology. The body is in an advanced state of mummification due to the desiccating action of the sand and the sealed environment, the medical examiner on-site noted, his gloved hands gently adjusting the edge of the red blanket to expose the cranial structure. The skin tissue is dry, leathery, and dark brown, but the anatomical landmarks are completely preserved. We have a distinct, localized indentation on the left side of the thyroid cartilage, the identical physical signature identified in the manual strangulation of Heather Drake in 2002. The mechanical force required to compress the cartilage in this manner is consistent with a professional sleeper hold applied from behind. "He didn't want them to scream, Raymond," Wes said, her voice tight and cold as she stared at the screen. "He used his knowledge of pressure points and physical restraint to disable them in seconds, preventing any struggle that would leave his own skin under their fingernails. He approached them like an archivist measuring a line, minimizing the friction, calculating the resistance, and executing the transition from life to death with absolute, silent efficiency." "And the trace?" Raymond asked, his eyes locking onto the high-resolution feed of the chest's interior lining. "Did he leave his signature inside the box?" "We are targeting the brass handle of the chest and the interior securing straps," the technician replied, already preparing the low-template DNA vacuum swabs. When he lifted her into this box, he had to exert immense physical force. He would have had to grip the interior edges of the oak frame to lower the body without disturbing the alignment of the blanket. Even if he wore heavy gloves, the interior corners of these chests are lined with raw, unpolished bronze brackets that would have caught the fabric, forcing him to adjust them or leaving behind microscopic skin cells from his wrists. The forensic team worked with a quiet, synchronized velocity, passing the collected swabs directly to the mobile DNA sequencing unit parked in the driveway. The machine, a sleek, silver casing that contained the latest high-throughput genetic analyzers, began its quiet, high-velocity processing, translating the ancient biological residues into a digital sequence that was transmitted via secure satellite link to the state database in Columbus. Within 45 minutes, the terminal in front of Raymond Vance in Columbus let out a sharp, double-tone alert, the screen flashing with a bright amber border that signaled a definitive 99.999% genetic alignment. Profile match: Richard Sterling. The match was absolute. The genetic signature recovered from the raw bronze brackets inside the oak chest was identical to the profile extracted from the blue backpack's zipper pull and the leather gardening gloves in his basement. The statistical probability of that DNA belonging to anyone else on the planet was 1 in 98 billion, creating an unassailable, biological lock that pinned the retired history teacher directly to the physical murder and concealment of Sarah Vance. While the recovery team on site finalized the transport of the remains, the legal framework for the capital indictment was being completely reorganized at the prosecutor's office in downtown Columbus. The success of the Oak Haven Protocol had successfully bridged the gap between different eras of law enforcement, creating a unified, digital timeline of violence that stretched from the early abductions of the late 1990s to the execution of Heather Drake in 2002. The state prosecutor had already drafted a comprehensive, multi-count capital indictment, each charge supported by a distinct, independent chain of molecular and physical evidence. In the adjacent conference room, Detective Sergeant West sat at a long table covered in empty paper coffee cups, her eyes tracking the documents on her screen. Beside her, the young deputy prosecutor was typing frantically on a laptop, preparing the formal motion for a rapid, direct filing indictment that would bypass the lengthy grand jury process and bring Sterling directly to a plea hearing by noon. "We have the DNA from the backpack's zipper pull," the prosecutor said, her eyes reflecting the glowing blue light of her monitor. "We have the genetic matches from the leather gloves in his basement. We have the physical recovery of Sarah Vance from the suburban tool shed, with Sterling's DNA on the interior bronze brackets. There is no jury in this state that will deliberate for more than an hour before returning a verdict of guilty on all counts." Sterling's defense team is already trying to negotiate a plea to avoid a death sentence. They know their client is dead in the water. "He doesn't get to negotiate," Raymond Vance said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that carried the deep, unresolved anger of 24 years of failure. He stood up slowly, his joints popping in the quiet room, and walked to the window to look out at the gray, mist-shrouded streets of the city. He kept Heather in the dark for 24 years. He kept Sarah under the concrete while he walked in the sun, taught our children, and enjoyed his quiet retirement in the suburb. He doesn't get to choose how he dies, and he certainly doesn't get to negotiate his comfort. We present the entire package to the judge, and we let the state demand the absolute maximum penalty under the law. The telephone on the desk rang, its sharp, electronic double tone shattering the silence of the room. Raymond grabbed the receiver before the second ring could finish. "Vance." "Raymond, we've cleared the suburban site." West's voice came through the line, carrying a quiet, heavy gravity that made the veteran detective's heart drop into his chest. "The transport vehicle containing Sarah's remains has just departed Whispering Pines under a state police escort. The medical examiner is already sealing the transport container for the trip to the state laboratory. It's her, Raymond. The school jacket, the initials. The search is over." Raymond did not speak for a long moment, his hand clutching the plastic receiver with a grip so tight his knuckles turned a stark, bloodless white. He looked down at his old, yellowed notebook on his desk, at the handwritten name of Heather Drake that had sat in his pocket for over 2 decades, and let out a long, shuddering breath that sounded like a sigh of relief. The promise he had made to a grieving community in the autumn of 2002 was finally and completely fulfilled. The children who had vanished into the quiet paths of the suburban green spaces had finally been brought home, their 24-year exile in the dark ended by the relentless, microscopic march of the future. "Get the lab teams ready," Raymond said, his voice cracking slightly before he regained his flat, professional composure. "I want the CT scanners on site the moment the transport vehicle arrives in Columbus. I want the bone and trace analysis completed before Sterling's defense team can even file their first discovery motion. We're going to close this door, Joanna, and we are going to lock it so tight that Richard Sterling will never see another sunrise that isn't framed by the steel bars of a maximum security prison." As the black transport hearse pulled away from the Whispering Pines property, its tires throwing up gravel as it turned onto the main suburban boulevard, the mist began to fall again, a cold, clean drizzle that washed away the tire tracks and the footprints of the recovery team. The quiet suburban community was finally waking up to a reality that was completely, permanently altered. A reality where the shadow that had lived in their forests and shared their streets was no longer a phantom, but a captured, aging predator whose final secrets had been dragged into the light of day. The reckoning had arrived, and the silence of 2002 was about to be broken once and for all by the cold, unyielding voice of justice. The pen that Richard Sterling had used to sign the plea agreement lay on the scarred oak table of the conference room, its plastic cap reflecting the harsh, vibrating glare of the overhead fluorescent tubes. It was 1:15 p.m. on July 16, 2026. Outside the heavy sandstone walls of the Franklin County Courthouse, the freezing rain had returned with a sudden, localized vengeance, sweeping across the gray, churning waters of the Scioto River and drumming a steady, deafening rhythm against the high-arched windows of the prosecutor's office. Inside the building, the air was static, cold, and thick with the heavy scent of wet wool, floor polish, and the metallic tang of ozone leaking from the bank of high-speed printers that were continuously churning out the finalized legal filings. The signature on the paper did not merely represent the legal capitulation of a 58-year-old retired history teacher. It was the formal, clinical collapse of a 24-year-old wall of silence that had kept the quiet suburb of Whispering Pines suspended in a state of unresolved trauma. For 24 years, the file of Heather Drake had existed as a physical and psychological black hole within the archives of the Columbus Police Department. It was a file defined by its absolute lack of answers, a cold case so perfectly insulated from resolution that it had passed into the realm of local folklore, a cautionary tale whispered in the late-night diners of the county and along the quiet, foggy paths of the Maple Grove. The image of the 16-year-old high school track athlete, whose blue canvas backpack was found resting neatly at the base of the ancient, hollow oak tree, had become a permanent part of the town's collective memory, a symbol of a time when the dark, unmonitored spaces of the suburban landscape could swallow a life in seconds without leaving a single trace of identity. But now, as the digital scanners on the third floor completed their final verification sweeps of the signed confession, that myth was being systematically dismantled, replaced page by page with the cold, unyielding logistics of a middle school teacher's routine. Detective Lieutenant Raymond Vance did not join the prosecution team as they gathered their briefcases to make the formal announcement to the waiting press corps on the plaza below. He stood alone in the narrow, glass-walled corridor of the cold case unit, his hands pressed flat against the cool surface of the window, watching the rain-slicked roofs of the city's municipal buildings. His snowy white hair stood out in sharp contrast to the dark, slate-gray sky, his face lined with the deep, permanent grooves of an exhaustion that had been 24 years in the making. He had carried Heather's photograph in his breast pocket through more than 2 decades of dead ends, false leads, and administrative indifference, watching his colleagues retire, his hair turn white, and the suburb he loved transform from a sleepy residential enclave into a bustling, high-tech commuter hub. He had survived the long, silent passage of time, and now, as the final data streams of the investigation converged on the screen behind him, he felt a sudden, physical lightness in his chest that felt less like victory and more like a quiet, final surrender to the truth. Behind him, the terminal workstation hummed with a low, constant vibration, its monitors displaying a complex, 3-dimensional digital map of the county's school transit corridors. The Oak Haven Protocol, was still operating at maximum capacity, its algorithms continuing to process the massive backlog of historical digital metadata that had been extracted from the archived files of the local school district and the regional cellular network providers. The screen was a web of overlapping lines, color-coded tracking vectors, and flashing priority alerts that linked the movement of Sterling's personal vehicle and mobile phone to the exact dates and times of several unresolved disappearances along the county lines between 1997 and 2004. The investigation was no longer focused on a single, isolated abduction in a Whispering Pines grove. It had expanded into a historic, regional tracking operation that was systematically mapping the career of a highly organized, local predator who had used the quiet, unmonitored walking paths of the suburbs as his private hunting grounds. The digital forensics team just completed the cross-reference of the 1998 Bremernaria files. Raymond, Detective Sergeant Joanna West said, her voice dropping to a quiet, intense whisper as she walked up to the window beside him. She carried a fresh, red-labeled document folder containing the preliminary forensic autopsy report of the 15-year-old student who had vanished from a school bus stop near the county border in the spring of that year. The patterns are identical. The school board records show that Sterling was serving as a traveling history curriculum coordinator during the exact week she disappeared. He had a temporary pass that allowed him to park his vehicle inside the restricted staff parking zones, less than 50 yards from where her bus route terminated. He didn't have to stalk her through the streets. He simply waited in the shadows of the school grove, using his official credentials to blend directly into the background of the afternoon dismissal. Raymond slowly took the folder from her hand, his eyes tracking the high-resolution photographs of the physical evidence recovered from the cedar floorboards of the tool shed and the interior of the leather gardening gloves. The images showed a series of microscopic, protein-protected biological packets that had been vacuum-swabbed from the deep, porous fibers of the materials, cells that had survived 27 years of soil moisture, humidity, and chemical washings to deliver a definitive 99.999% genetic match to the victims. It was a molecular signature of violence, a series of invisible links that connected the victims, the private structures of the suspect's home, and his professional schedule into an iron circle of guilt from which there was no escape. He used the topography, Joanna, Raymond said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that seemed to carry the cold dampness of the storm outside. Look at the drainage patterns and soil composition maps from the autumn of 2002. The clay-heavy till of the grove was highly compact, but the areas near the ancient oak root systems contained deep pockets of dry, sandy soil that had accumulated from the old creek beds. Sterling didn't have to carry his tools through the public streets. He knew the physical properties of the park better than any city surveyor. He knew when to move, he knew which paths would remain unpaved during the winter utility projects, and he knew that the heavy concrete caps he poured in his backyard would keep his secrets insulated from the search dogs. He was a historic preservationist of his own graves. The sheer, detached sociopathy of Sterling's methodology was a silent, suffocating presence in the quiet hallway. He had not been driven by a sudden, uncontrollable surge of rage or a chaotic, disorganized impulse. He had approached the abductions of these young girls with the same structural, mathematical precision he used to organize his historical archives. He calculated the load limits of his tool chests, the specific gravity of the concrete mixtures he poured in his backyard, the chemical resistance of the synthetic plastic sheeting he cut by hand, and the precise timing of the school district's bus routes, turning the natural beauty of the suburban green spaces into his private, physical filing system. He had lived in the open, sharing the local parks with his neighbors, offering polite advice on historical research to the children at the library, and participating in the local community festivals, completely insulated from the suspicion of the law by the quiet, respectable rhythm of his professional identity. But the progress of the world had outrun his calculations. The Oakhaven Protocol had successfully bridged the gap between different eras of law enforcement, creating a unified, digital timeline of violence that stretched from the early abductions of the late 1990s to the execution of Heather Drake in 2002. The realization that an enclosed space, whether it was the metallic housing of a backpack zipper pull, the interior lining of a leather glove, or the dry sand beneath a concrete slab, could preserve a suspect's biological signature for decades had transformed the nature of cold case investigations across the country. It was a technological revolution that had stripped the concept of the perfect crime of its intellectual foundation, proving that every physical touch and every breath was a permanent, biological confession waiting for the future to read it. At 2 p.m., the state prosecution team held their formal press conference in the main ceremonial courtroom of the Franklin County Courthouse. The space was packed to its absolute capacity, with over 200 reporters, local residents, and city officials squeezed into the dark oak pews under the high, vaulted ceilings. The air inside the room was warm, thick with the damp heat of wet raincoats and the low, frantic murmur of a community that was finally preparing to hear the ending of a story that had haunted them for a generation. In the front row of the gallery, sitting with their hands clasped tightly in their laps, were the surviving family members of Heather Drake and Sarah Vance, their faces pale, their eyes fixed on the empty wooden tables of the defense and the prosecution, their lives having been suspended for over 2 decades in a state of hypervigilant grief. The prosecutor, a tall, sharp-featured woman with a quiet, administrative authority, walked up to the mahogany podium, her movements slow and deliberate. She did not open her presentation with a theatrical flourish or a dramatic summary of the crime. She simply opened her blue document binder and began to read the cold, clinical details of the capital indictment, her voice carrying across the silent, packed courtroom like the steady tolling of a bell. Today, the state of Ohio, in coordination with the Columbus Police Department and the State Cold Case Task Force, has formally entered a negotiated plea of guilty in the case of State versus Richard Sterling, she read, her eyes tracking the paper. Under the terms of this agreement, the defendant has entered an unconditional, binding plea of guilty to multiple separate counts of first-degree capital murder, including the 2002 homicide of Heather Drake, the 1999 homicide of Sarah Vance, and additional cold case homicides dating back to the late 1990s. In exchange for his immediate confession, his full cooperation in identifying the remaining recovery sites, and his waiver of all future rights of appeal, the state has agreed to withdraw its request for the death penalty. Richard Sterling has been sentenced to consecutive terms of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, to be served in the maximum security facility at Warren. The courtroom remained absolutely silent for a long, heavy beat, the only sound the steady, mechanical clicking of the photographer's shutters and the quiet, stifled sob of Heather Drake's mother, who buried her face in her hands as the finality of the sentence washed over her. It was not a moment of sudden, dramatic joy. It was a physical, exhausting release of a tension that had shaped the very architecture of how these families lived, watched their children, and walked through the streets of their own neighborhoods. The memory of their loved ones was no longer anchored to a dark, wet path, an unsolved mystery, or a terrifying, faceless phantom of the woods. It was now safely, permanently written into the historical record of justice, protected from the decay of time by the absolute certainty of the physical evidence. In the basement of the courthouse, inside the high-security holding cells where the prisoners were processed for transport to the state penitentiary, Richard Sterling sat on the narrow metal bench, his back pressed against the cold concrete wall. He was dressed in the bright orange jumpsuit of a maximum security inmate, his civilian clothes having been stripped, cataloged, and sealed in an evidence bag for transport to the state archives. His thin, 58-year-old hands were secured to a heavy transport belt, the steel links of his handcuffs clinking softly with every shallow rise and fall of his chest. He looked smaller now, his shoulders hunched, his eyes wide and vacant as they stared at the gray linoleum floor, his carefully manicured persona of the quiet, intellectual schoolteacher having been completely hollowed out by the relentless progression of the court. He could hear the low, vibrating roar of the transport van's diesel engine idling in the subterranean garage outside his cell, a sound that seemed to mimic the steady, mechanical countdown of the time he had left on this earth. He was no longer the master of his own destiny, the clever history teacher who had outrun the law for 24 years. He was a number in a digital database, a physical object to be processed, stored, and managed by a system that had no interest in his explanations or his excuses. His silence had been broken, his secrets exposed, and his long, dark road had finally terminated in a concrete room of his own making. Outside the courthouse, the rain had turned into a light, shimmering mist that coated the historic brick facades of the city in a thin, silver layer of ice. The crowds were slowly beginning to disperse, the media trucks lowering their satellite dishes, the reporters packing their equipment to rush back to their studios for the evening broadcasts. But in the narrow Maple Grove pathway behind Oak Street, where the blue canvas backpack had once rested in the autumn leaves, a small group of local residents had gathered near the entrance of the path. They did not speak. They did not carry signs or light candles. They simply stood in the cold mist, looking at the wet earth that had held the town's dark secret for 24 years, their faces calm, their silence holding a quiet, respectful peace that had been missing from the suburb since the autumn of 2002. Raymond Vance walked down the stone steps of the courthouse, his heavy wool coat pulled tight against the wind, his boots crunching softly on the wet pavement. He did not look at the remaining television cameras. He walked past the media cordon, turning onto the narrow street that led down to the old library square where the search had first begun so many years ago. He knew that the fight was not truly over, that there would always be predators hiding behind the polite facades of suburban respectability, using the quiet, empty spaces of the world to harbor their dark desires. But he also knew that the terrain of the battle had changed forever. The science of the future had stripped the dark of its safety, leaving the phantoms of the past with nowhere left to run and no secrets left to keep, as the world moved steadily, relentlessly, and beautifully into the light of a new day. The transition from the high-profile courtroom to the subterranean loading dock of the Franklin County Courthouse was a descent into a world of bare concrete and cold steel. It was 3:15 p.m. on July 16, 2026. The hum of the idling diesel engine of the heavy transport van was a low, vibrating drone that bounced off the low concrete ceiling, filling the enclosed space with a thick, choking smell of exhaust and damp stone. Richard Sterling was led out of the holding cell by two armed state transport deputies, his ankles shuffling in a slow, rhythmic cadence as the heavy steel chains of his leg irons scraped against the wet pavement. He was dressed in the bright orange jumpsuit of a maximum security transport prisoner, his head bowed, his eyes vacant, his entire physical posture signaling a total, structural surrender to the reality of his confinement. Behind the heavy, reinforced glass of the security office overlooking the dock, Detective Lieutenant Raymond Vance stood with his hands resting on his leather belt, his eyes tracking every movement of the man he had pursued across the decades. Beside him, Detective Sergeant Joanna West was uploading the final judicial transit orders to the state's secure database. The Oak Haven Protocol had finished its primary work. The digital files were locked, the DNA profiles were cataloged, and the signed plea agreement was currently being processed by the administrative clerks of the High Court. The 24-year-old mystery of Whispering Pines was no longer an open wound. It was a closed, archived chapter of the state's criminal history, its truth secured by the unyielding precision of a future that had refused to let the past go unnoticed. "They're moving him directly to the high-security processing unit at Walla Walla," West said, her voice dropping to a quiet, flat pitch that barely carried over the hum of the computers. She closed her digital folder, the screen's cool blue glow fading from her eyes. "The transit route has been cleared by the State Patrol, bypassing the local county facilities to avoid any potential security risks along the pass. He will be in his permanent cell before the sun sets over the mountains." The legal defense team has confirmed that they will not be filing any transitional motions. "He's accepted his fate, Raymond. He knows the wall has snapped shut." Raymond Vance did not answer immediately. He watched as the transport deputies secured Sterling's waist chains to the interior anchor bolts of the van, the sharp, metallic clink of the padlocks sounding like a series of definitive, structural seals. He had spent more than half of his professional life waiting for this exact, quiet afternoon, waiting through the cold rains of 2002, the administrative reorganizations of the early 2010s, and the slow, agonizing years of retirement when the file sat in his personal desk like a silent, burning coal. He had believed that when the day finally arrived, he would feel a sudden, explosive surge of triumph, a dramatic release of the tension that had shaped the very architecture of his mind. But standing behind the security glass, watching the aging history teacher being loaded into a metal box like a piece of salvaged cargo, he felt only a deep, exhausting stillness. "It's the quiet that surprises me, Joanna," Raymond whispered, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that carried the damp chill of the river outside. "In 2002, we thought that when we caught him, there would be a great reckoning, a public trial that would lay bare all the secrets of the suburb. We wanted to see him stand in the light, to have to explain to the families why he took their children, why he chose that path, why he left the backpack. But there is no explanation. There is only this: an old man in a bright orange suit, being driven over the mountains in a diesel van to spend the rest of his days in a concrete room. The system has processed him like an old, outdated ledger. It's clinical, it's mathematical, and it's entirely devoid of the drama we spent 20 years preparing for. That is because the science has taken the theater out of the courtroom, Raymond," West replied, leaning her shoulder against the glass. "In the early 2000s, a trial was a performance. It was a battle of narratives, a competition between who had the more persuasive lawyer, the more emotional presentation, or the better luck with the jury. A clever defendant could hide behind a reasonable doubt because the evidence of the era was subjective. It relied on the fragile, shifting memories of witnesses and the primitive interpretations of blood and fibers. But you cannot perform against a genetic sequence. You cannot argue with the molecular structure of your own skin cells trapped inside the weave of a backpack's zipper pull. The technology has made the truth so absolute that there is no room left for a story." Sterling didn't plead because he wanted to spare the families. He pled because his lawyers knew that the moment we laid those digital DNA graphs on the table, the trial was over before it even began. The physical reality of the transition was a silent, suffocating presence in the loading dock. Outside the courthouse, the media trucks were already beginning to lower their telescoping microwave masts, the reporters packing their high-definition cameras and their heavy tripods into the backs of their utility vans, their focus already shifting to the next breaking news cycle of the metropolitan area. The local community was slowly beginning to disperse, the residents of Whispering Pines returning to their coffee houses, their offices, and their homes, their faces calm under the gray, mist-shrouded sky. The shadow that had lived in their quiet streets for 24 years was no longer a phantom, a terrifying legend of the autumn nights. He was a captured, 58-year-old felon, unmasked, labeled, and permanently locked behind the steel gates of the state penitentiary. As the heavy, reinforced rear doors of the transport van swung closed, their dual locking bars clicking into place with a sharp, hydraulic hiss, Raymond Vance reached into his breast pocket. His fingers brushed against the worn, frayed corners of the old leather-bound notebook he had carried to the Maple Grove crime scene on the night of October 12, 2002. He pulled the notebook out, his rough thumb tracing the faded gold lettering of his initials on the cover before flipping it open to the very first page. There, written in his own youthful, aggressive hand, was the name of Heather Drake, followed by a list of the physical coordinates of the path, the measurement of the tree root structures, and the serial number of the blue canvas backpack. He looked at the page for a long, silent moment, the faded blue ink standing out against the yellowed paper like a ghost from a different era of law enforcement. He had spent 24 years keeping this notebook within arm's reach, treating it as a physical anchor to a promise that had kept him from ever truly leaving the department, even after his retirement papers had been signed and his active duty locker had been cleared. He had believed that the notebook was his duty, a burden he was condemned to carry until the day his own heart stopped beating. But now, as the diesel transport van slowly pulled out of the loading bay, its tires throwing up a fine spray of wet gravel as it turned onto the main highway toward the pass, he realized that the notebook was no longer a weight. It was just paper. "What are you going to do with that, Raymond?" Joanna West asked, her eyes tracking his hand as he slowly closed the cover of the old notebook. Raymond Vance let out a long, slow breath that sounded like a sigh of relief, his shoulders slumping as the final, lingering residues of the 24-year tension evaporated from his chest. He looked at the heavy, dark green dumpster that sat in the corner of the security office's parking deck, its steel lid wet with the falling mist. He walked out of the secure booth, his boots clicking softly on the concrete, and stood beside the metal bin. With a single, quiet motion of his hand, he tossed the old notebook into the dark interior, the paper hitting the bottom with a quiet, hollow thud that was instantly swallowed by the low roar of the city's afternoon traffic. "I'm going to go home, Joanna," Raymond said, a faint, genuine smile appearing at the corners of his mouth for the first time in 24 years. "I'm going to sit on my deck, I'm going to watch the wind move through the maples, and I'm going to let the rain fall without having to ask what it's washing away." He turned and walked toward the exit of the garage, his heavy wool coat pulled tight against the wind, his boots crunching softly on the wet pavement as he stepped out into the clean, bright light of a new afternoon. The long, dark highway of the suburban cold case had finally reached its end, brought to ground by the relentless, microscopic voice of a future that had refused to let Heather Drake's memory be forgotten. The silence of 2002 was broken, the truth had been secured, and the memory of the young track star who had vanished into the Maple Grove was finally, and beautifully, safe in the light of day. The relentless grind of the digital processors inside the Columbus cold case unit had settled into a steady, rhythmic hum, a clinical white noise that seemed to mark the passage of a new era of justice. It was 3:30 p.m. on July 16, 2026. On the third floor of the State Police Division headquarters, the chaotic, high-velocity energy of the morning's arrest had transitioned into a quiet, methodical archiving of the physical truth. The long digital monitors that had for weeks been covered in glowing green maps of the county transit corridors, genetic pedigree charts, and high-resolution scans of Richard Sterling's personal curriculum schedules were systematically being shut down. One by one, the displays faded to a deep, silent black, reflecting the exhausted faces of the detectives and analysts who had spent their youth chasing a phantom, only to find him hiding in the open behind a shield of suburban respectability. Detective Sergeant Joanna West sat at her terminal, her eyes tracking the progress of the automated system as it archived the physical evidence logs from the Whispering Pines path and the residential tool shed. Beside her, Detective Lieutenant Raymond Vance sat with his head tilted back against the headrest of his chair, his eyes closed, his hands resting flat on his knees. He had not worn his badge since the morning of the plea agreement, his transition to retirement finally feeling real after 24 years of carrying the weight of Heather Drake's file in his chest. "We just received the confirmation from the State Penitentiary Registry, Raymond," West said, her voice dropping to a soft, weary murmur as she closed her laptop, the screen's blue light fading from her eyes. "Richard Sterling has been formally processed into the maximum security unit at Warren. The transfer was completed without incident. He has been assigned his permanent cell block, his civilian clothes have been destroyed, and he is officially registered as inmate number 02-9984S. The state has closed the file. The legal defense team has confirmed that no transitional motions or appeals will be filed. The Iron Circle is complete." Raymond did not open his eyes immediately. He let out a long, slow breath that sounded like a sigh of relief, a physical shifting of the earth beneath his feet as the promise he had made to a grieving community in the autumn of 2002 was finally and completely fulfilled. "He signed because he knew we had the soil and the gloves, Joanna," he whispered, his voice cracking slightly before he regained his flat, professional composure. "A man who spent his entire life organizing school curriculum files and pouring concrete slabs to keep his secrets safe doesn't have the stomach to sit in a public courtroom and watch a jury look at the chemical analysis of the clay that held his victims. He wanted to hide behind a piece of paper, just like he hid behind his teaching credentials and his neighborhood reputation. But the paper doesn't protect him anymore." The significance of the dual prosecution, linking the 2002 Whispering Pines execution to the 1999 Oak Ridge abduction, was already radiating through the administrative offices of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the State Police Academy. The integration of next-generation contact DNA, touch DNA, recovery from protected synthetic fabrics and leather goods was being hailed as the most significant structural advancement in forensic science since the introduction of polymerase chain reaction, PCR, testing in the late 20th century. The realization that an enclosed space or a tight zipper flap could preserve a suspect's microscopic, friction-transferred skin cells for over 2 decades had effectively stripped the concept of the perfect crime of its technical foundation, proving that every physical touch and every breath was a permanent, biological confession waiting for the future to read it. In the quiet Whispering Pines neighborhood where Sterling had spent his long years of retirement, the process of social extraction was complete. The ranch-style brick home and the small backyard, which had once stood as monuments to mundane suburban respectability, were now surrounded by a high, black wooden fence to shield the property from the eyes of the public. The local city council, recognizing the profound, paralyzing trauma that the site represented to the community, had already approved the funding for the total demolition of the tool shed and the restoration of the yard, ensuring that no future buyer could ever walk the ground where Sarah Vance's storage chest had been buried, and no child would ever play in the shadow of the structure that had held the city's dark secrets. The empty space would be seeded with wild grass and turned into a small, quiet memorial park, a silent, empty space designed to let the neighborhood finally begin the slow, agonizing process of healing. But while the physical structures of his life were being systematically erased, the scientific and legal implications of his arrest were just beginning to redefine the standards of cold case resolution across the country. The State Police Academy had already established a permanent, multi-million-dollar funding package to train local detectives in the application of the Oak Haven Protocol, ensuring that the dusty, forgotten archives of rural sheriff's departments would never again be allowed to harbor the secrets of active predators. The blue canvas backpack, which had sat for 24 years in a heat-sealed plastic bag as a silent witness to Heather Drake's disappearance, was to be placed in a secure, climate-controlled display case at the Academy's museum, a physical teaching tool for future generations of investigators, representing the absolute, unyielding power of patience and microscopic detail. At 4 p.m., the state prosecutor held a formal press conference on the steps of the Columbus courthouse. The rain had completely stopped, leaving the stone stairs wet and gleaming under the brilliant afternoon sun. As the prosecutor stood before the bank of microphones, her voice carrying across the silent, packed plaza, she did not speak of the complexity of the legal strategies or the brilliance of the investigative tactics. She spoke directly to the families of Heather Drake, Sarah Vance, and the other young women whose lives had been stolen along the quiet walking paths, who sat in the front row of the gallery, their faces pale but clear under the open sky. For 24 years, the state of Ohio and the community of Whispering Pines owed a debt to these families, the prosecutor said, her voice echoing off the sandstone facade of the building. A debt of truth, a debt of justice, and a debt of memory. Today, through the relentless determination of our cold case task force and the absolute, unyielding precision of modern science, that debt has been paid in full. Richard Sterling will spend the remainder of his natural life behind the concrete walls of a maximum security prison, with no possibility of parole, no opportunity for appeal, and no escape from the reality of his actions. The shadows that held his secrets for decades have been burned away, and the children he stole have finally been brought home to rest in the light. As the press conference concluded and the crowd began to disperse, the family of Heather Drake walked slowly down the steps toward their car. Her older brother, who had been only 10 years old on the night she vanished, held a small, polished mahogany box in his hands. Inside the box was the tarnished silver-plated locket that the recovery teams had lifted from the evidence locker, the physical, tragic remnant of the sister who had disappeared into the freezing autumn of 2002. He did not look at the cameras or the reporters who watched him pass. He kept his eyes fixed on the simple, dignified box, his hand resting gently on the smooth wood as if he were holding his sister's hand for the first time in 24 years. The silence of 2002 had not just been broken, it had been completely, systematically dismantled, replaced by the sober, quiet comfort of the truth. The story of the cold case was over. The forensic loops had completed their long, slow rotation, and the memory of the children who had been lost in the dark was finally and permanently safe from the shadow of the monster. As the twilight began to settle over the hills of the valley and the wet streets of Whispering Pines, The two worlds that had been linked by a chain of violence felt a fraction cleaner, the air a fraction lighter, and the long, agonizing nightmare had finally reached its absolute, unalterable end. The quiet that settled over the third floor of the State Police Division headquarters in Columbus was different from the heavy, stagnant silence of the decades when the files had remained frozen in the steel archival cabinets. It was 4:30 p.m. on July 16, 2026. Outside, the last remnants of the low, bruised rain clouds were pulling away toward the eastern horizon, leaving behind a clean, slate-gray sky that seemed to reflect the clinical finality of the day's events. The digital servers in the building's basement let out a low, vibrating hum, a mechanical white noise that had replaced the sound of the rain, marking the transition from the frantic, high-velocity energy of the morning's arrest to the slow, systematic archiving of a permanent, unalterable truth. Detective Sergeant Joanna West sat before the final, active terminal, her face illuminated by the cool, blue glare of the monitor as she watched the migration of the final data packets. The Oak Haven Protocol was no longer a temporary tool assembled in a moment of desperate necessity. It had been formalized into the structural blueprint of modern law enforcement, an automated network designed to ensure that no biological trace left behind by a predator could ever be lost to the passage of time. On the screen, the digital representation of the Whispering Pines and Oak Ridge cases was a clean, glowing interface that categorized every genetic marker, every soil analysis, and every environmental